He looked awestruck and maybe like he'd just been given a glimpse of Valhalla. That will do. Thank you, Thor. She breathed a relieved sigh as his beautiful emerald green eyes opened and met hers, a beaming smile within their seemingly glowing depths. Like magnets, they were drawn back together and their mouths met once again in a soft, exploratory kiss that lasted for at least a minute before getting a little more intense. Astrid found her hands creeping up and around his shoulders, fingers tangling in his silky auburn hair. She gave a little hum of approval when his arms wrapped around her waist in a gentle grasp, and she shifted even closer to him. This is a million times better than that awful kiss Olaf forced on me. Feeling braver than he ever had in his life, Hiccup daringly opened his mouth a little wider and licked at the seam of her petal-soft lips. She gasped lightly in surprise and then returned the caress. Now practically humming with satisfaction, Hiccup did it again, but so did she. Their tongues met. Retreated. Met again. Licked lightly. Tentatively. Pleasure and electricity raced through them. He groaned his approval. She moaned in her throat. And then his tongue was in her mouth and he was exploring her sweet taste like he'd never expected to be able to do. I could die right now and be the happiest of boys. He determinedly ignored the arousal she inspired and concentrated only on learning every tiny detail of her mouth and what actions made her squirm with pleasure in his arms. After a few more perfect moments of oral sparring, Astrid reluctantly pulled back a fraction when she started to feel lightheaded, realizing it wasn't from how amazing this kiss was, but from the lack of air. She rested her forehead on his, their eyes looking at each other with adoring awe, as she let go of his hair and hugged his neck. I like kissing you, she whispered. I like kissing you, too, Hiccup managed to croak out, his heart pounding at 1,000 beats per minute. He was pretty sure he was dreaming. His arms were wrapped around Astrid and his mouth had been attached to hers. This couldn't possibly be reality. The small pain in his palm where a piece of broken metal was poking it said otherwise. Hiccup dropped the little skull with a quick flick of his wrist, ignoring the sound of metal on stone as it bounced away. He couldn't tear his eyes from her beautiful blue ones that reminded him of a rare flower that only bloomed for 3 days per year. She was looking at him with something he was afraid to name, but the word love definitely came to mind anyway. His father did have a point, someone else was bound to win her over eventually if he didn't at least try. Hiccup decided that it was now or never. So he sucked in a big breath for courage and blurted out in something that essentially ran together as one word, I love you, Astrid. Will you marry me when we're old enough? Astrid leaned back in surprise in his arms, staring at him with wide, blinking eyes as her jaw dropped. Holy hell, I was never expecting that to come out of him. I would have been happy with a confession of, I like you, Astrid, a lot. This, though. This is much better. So much better. I knew there was a reason I loved this boy. Yes. Astrid all but leapt on him, knocking him down onto his back on the white bench, and planted enthusiastic kisses on his cheeks and nose and jaw between even more breathy yes. He stared up at the girl mostly sprawled across his upper body, the soft mounds of her chest pressing against him in a way that threatened to permanently fry his brain, and her hands on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what he was more shocked at, their position or her answer. He quickly settled on the later, since she'd hugged him before, just never in a reclining position. Holy yak. She actually said yes. She's clearly a few sheep shy of a herd if she thinks I'm appropriate marriage material, but I'm never in a million years going to tell her that. Once he recovered from his shock that Astrid had actually said yes, Hiccup kissed her back, moving one hand up to bury in the depths of her braid at her nape and hold her still so he could capture her wandering lips properly again. Not that he really knew what properly was, but they seemed to be doing all right, judging by how it felt, her happy purrs, and the pleasure zinging through him. Some unknown time later, Astrid pulled away again, feeling a little overwhelmed, and moved to rest her head on his chest. As she listened to his heart pound under her ear at essentially the same rate hers was, she thought it only fair that she confessed her feelings as well. I love you too, Hiccup. I always have. Hiccup looked at the top of her head in renewed shock. He could kind of understand the always part, since he'd always loved her too, in one fashion or another. But what he couldn't quite understand was how she could love him now, not when there were other guys available to pick from. Bigger guys. Stronger guys. guys that were either already full-fledged Vikings or would be after the next dragon training. He would never be true a Viking in the eyes of their tribe, or many other tribes for that matter. Not unless he managed to talk his father into letting him take the dragon training course next year. Yeah, right. Like that's ever going to happen. But maybe. Maybe there's another way to prove myself. A vague idea took root in that moment that Hiccup would have to think about further some other time. But right now, his curiosity was killing him. Why me? He said suddenly. Hiccup Astrid chided as she sat up, folding her legs under her, and he followed, sitting cross-legged on the bench. She tilted her head to the side. Why not you? Hiccup spread his arms wide, glancing down at himself. You seriously don't see anything wrong with this? Astrid studied him up and down, trying to find the flaw he seemed to think was there and found nothing. His face was as cute as ever, topped by that hair that made her smile more often than not with its riotous autumn colors and nature. His physique was still lean, but the layer of hard muscle over his bones gave testament to his years of work. She did admit that he might be shorter than her now, but she had faith that he would grow like a weed again soon enough. His father qualified as a small mountain. Hiccup had to at least come close to resembling Stoic in height, if not breadth, sooner or later. She grinned at him. Nope. I see nothing wrong with you. You're the epitome of cute. And I'm betting that you'll grow up to be the epitome of handsome and take my breath away on a daily basis even more than you already do. She clearly has a better opinion of my looks than I do, but I guess that's a good thing. Thor, she thinks I'm cute. Hiccup felt his face heat at the praise, but he couldn't help picking at his own insecurities. But I'm short, and scrawny, and I'll probably never be a dragon warrior. I wish I could kill Stoic for making Hiccup think he's not good enough. There is nothing wrong with this boy that a little confidence from his father wouldn't fix. But since Stoic isn't likely to ever get a clue, I'll have to do what I can myself. Astrid huffed a sigh and stood, dragging him up to his feet by his hand. As she marched towards the table with him stumbling along behind her, she said, I can almost guarantee the height thing is temporary, so get over that. And I don't care if you're a dragon warrior or not, you have so much else going for you, it's not even funny. She pulled out a chair on one side of the table and pushed him into it. Hiccup gawked up at her, not having a clue where she was going with this. Astrid sat in a chair opposite of him and held her hand up, elbow on the table. And as far as scrawny goes, I don't think you understand just how strong you are, so let me demonstrate. Hiccup eyed her hand suspiciously. Why does it look like she wants to arm wrestle with me? It's been years since we tried that. Because she did, he realized, as she huffed in exasperation and reached over and grabbed his hand, forcefully putting his elbow on the table too. How does this prove anything? He asked, even as he noticed how cute her hand looked held in his bigger one, feeling their calluses rub against each other's skin. And that was something he hadn't noticed before, that his hands were bigger than hers. Maybe I really am going to grow some more. Yeah. Astrid glared at him through her bangs like he'd forgotten he was an intelligent being. Do you consider me to be strong? Yes, of course, he rushed to say, not wanting to offend her any further than he already had in whatever way he'd done so. He wasn't lying, though. Astrid was a lean but curvy package of supple strength from years of warrior training. He'd seen her throw Snotlout around like the stout boy was made of dry grass, and win sparring matches against her father, who was only a bit smaller than his own. Good. Now arm wrestle me like you mean it. Pretend I'm Snotlout or something. Astrid looked at him steadily until he nodded once and readjusted his grip on her fingers. She smiled as she felt the bones in her hand being lightly crushed together. He didn't know his own strength, just as she thought. 1. 2 Hiccup said next, staring at her eyes and watching them narrow in concentration. 3 they said together, and the battle was on. Hiccup braced himself, hoping to at least not be walloped in the first couple of seconds like always used to happen, and was surprised when the pressure she put on his hand didn't immediately slam it against the table. He could see that she was definitely trying, the strain on her expression and in her arm muscles was clearly apparent. And then he did what she suggested and pretended that she was Snotlout. Or better yet, Ilof. Gods, I hate him. How I hate. He started to win. And 2 seconds later, her hand slammed against the table. Hiccup looked at his arm like he'd never seen it before. Loki's bony knees, I didn't know I could do that. Astrid burst into laughter. Gods, Hiccup, you think all those years of swinging a hammer haven't built up some muscle? Or the training we do when we can? You may not be built like a boulder like the average Viking male, but you're no scrawny wimp. I guess not, Hiccup admitted, somewhat hesitantly. You're not, Astrid said firmly. And anyone who says otherwise is going to regret it. Hiccup didn't know how he felt about having a girl defend him, but it was Astrid, so there was no way he was ever going to talk her out of her ideas. This was confirmed as she continued on with, in fact, some of them already do. The contented smirk she wore just affirmed that she had enjoyed beating up whoever had offended her on his behalf. I'd bet almost anything one of them was Snotlout. You're like a beautiful Valkyrie come to earth, you know that, he blurted out, unable to help himself as he gazed at her adoringly with his chin resting on a loose fist. Astrid giggled, a becoming blush settling on her sculpted cheekbones. She rose from her chair and leaned across the table, kissing his mouth in a lingering fashion, making his cheeks flush too. And you're the smartest person on the whole island, probably the whole planet. And did I mention cute? 'Cause I'm sure I did. Hiccup was trying to come up with an appropriate response to that when the door banged open and his father stomped in like a pissed-off polar bear. He marched halfway to them and glared at them from under his heavy brows. What in Thor's name? Hiccup thought in alarm, a bad feeling settling in his gut. Get out of my house, Astrid, and never come back, the chief of Berk growled out after a few long seconds of tension-filled silence. What? That's not fair. Hiccup exclaimed, shooting up to his feet as Astrid stood and startled, sidling towards the door by going around the fireplace. He followed her. What has she done to warrant that? I don't have to explain myself, Stoic snarled as he stomped back to the door and waited for Astrid to leave, his white-knuckled hand holding it open for her. She stepped out, afraid to say a word, unable to recall a time when Stoic had looked so angry or dangerous. Astrid shot Hiccup a helpless look that just about killed him. All he could do was shrug and mouth, later, so she knew he'd talk to her as soon as he could manage it. And then his father slammed the door in her face. Hiccup stared at the closed door for a moment before changing his focus, rage filling him at how his father had treated Astrid. What in hell's name was that? I thought you wanted me to court her. Hiccup yelled at his father's back as Stoic stomped towards the closed door to the left of the stairs. Not anymore. Stoic yelled back, just before he slammed the door to his room, leaving one very confused and hurting Hiccup standing alone in the middle of the living room. What could possibly have happened to Dad in the last 2 hours to cause such a change in his attitude? /N, Hel is the Norse goddess of the underworld and is Loki's daughter. Aside from the different parentage, she is essentially the same person as Hela, Thor's sister in the Marvel Universe. Chapter 8, The Rift, Part 1. Chapter Text. The Rift, Part 1. Earlier. Ilof took a step towards the target containing his dagger and then immediately stopped with a whimper. Pushing his tunic to the side, he extricated his sorely put upon manhood from his leggings and cursed foully. That bitch actually made me bleed. Gods, how long is that going to take to heal? Grimacing, he gingerly tucked himself back in and flinched over to the target, rage drowning out most of the pain. As Ilof made his way back down to the village, only one thought was prevalent in his mind. Astrid Horfason is going to pay for this. Stoic was working on his third beer when Ilof stormed into the tavern like a furious thundercloud. Curious, he tracked the young man on his journey through the tables and benches until Ilof joined a group of his friends. The 16 to 20-year-old group that weren't really mature enough yet to hang out with the old people, but were old enough to consider hanging out at the tavern an acceptable pastime. The boy immediately started muttering to his friends, clearly complaining about something if his flailing arms and red face was anything to go by. Stoic raised a brow at Ilof's father, who was a few bodies over and across the table from him. Oi. Olaf. Any idea what's up with your boy? The large Viking snorted into his mug of beer, glancing over at the other table. Astrid probably rejected him again. Boy's been after her for months. Hector, who was across from Stoic, grinned behind his raised mug, sending a teasing smirk at Olaf. That's because my girl's too smart for the likes of your son. Hey. Olaf said with token offense. But everyone knew he didn't mean it. Just cause Olaf isn't the smartest kid on the island doesn't mean he's not a catch. Stoic nodded over to the other side of the room where one of the younger barmaids was currently leaning over Olaf and blatantly displaying her abundant cleavage for him to see as she placed a mug of beer in front of the teenager. There's a whole flock of young women who agree with you, Olaf. Your son just needs to pick one of them. Stoic paused to sip at his beer. Besides, my boy is the one who's going to marry Astrid, he said proudly, a smirk twitching his thick mustache up on one side. Hector spewed out the gulp of beer he'd just taken, splattering Stoic with spit and foam, as Gobber, Bucket, Spitaloot, and everyone else at their table burst into guffaws of laughter. Hiccup. Marry Astrid. Over my rotting corpse. Astrid's father glared virtual daggers at his friend as he thunked his mug down onto the table, making it slosh over. Stoic slammed his mug down too, then deliberately wiped his face as he turned red with the rage building in him. He placed his hands on the table and loomed over it, crowding into Hector's personal space. What did you mean by that? He asked slowly and very dangerously. Not one to back down, Hector copied Stoic's stance, pushing his chief back a bit so they were centered over the table. The whole tavern hushed as people realized that something exciting was happening and all eyes trained on the longtime friends. I mean, Hector said through clenched teeth, that your son is not good enough to marry my daughter. Stoic sucked in an outraged breath as the tavern gave an oh as a whole. Pretty much every person there silently agreed with Hector, but no one had ever been brave enough, or stupid enough, to say anything against Hiccup to Stoic's face before. What's wrong with my son? Stoic growled in a deep rumble that every person felt in their bones, causing goosebumps to rise. His eyes narrowed as he gave Hector a look that said he better choose his next words very carefully or he would be paying tribute to hell with a broken and bloody offering. Hector was just drunk enough to decide that he could face the wrath of hell and win. Your son, Stoic the vast, vaunted chief of our tribe, is a tiny excuse for a human being who you've raised to never be seen as a respected Viking of this or any tribe, never letting him leave home or training him with weapons like you should. I will never give my daughter permission to marry someone who couldn't possibly be strong enough to protect her or her children. That's not true. Hiccup's more than worthy. Isn't he? Shoving aside the doubting niggle of a thought, Stoic huffed as his mind, fortified by Odyssey-inducing alcohol, came up with an equally hurtful retort. Well, maybe I don't want Hiccup associating with your daughter anyway. Don't think I haven't noticed the way the boys in this village hang all over her. Odin knows, she's probably slept with the whole lot of them. Oh, came from their audience once again, all eyes going wide at the slur to Astrid's honor. Hector turned just as red as Stoic, steam practically coming out of both of their ears now. How dare you? He was just about to throw a punch at Stoic when another voice paused his fist in midair. Olaf saw his chance to make Astrid pay, so he took it. He jumped to his feet and called across the room, it's true. Astrid's very free with her affections. Shut up, Olaf said warningly, narrowing his eyes at his son. Olaf ignored his father and forged on. He glanced at his buddies, silently telling them to back him up. And after what he'd told them about his injured manhood, they were willing enough. We've all had her, haven't we, boys? The other young men at the table nodded enthusiastically, putting on matching leers. Now Hector looked like he was ready to go over to Olaf and kill him instead, or as well. Olaf grabbed Hector by the tunic before he could do more than swing one leg over the bench. Go home, Olaf. Olaf yelled. You're going to regret saying mistruths about Astrid. Olaf glared at all the young men. All of you. Get out. They scrambled off their benches and made themselves scarce. But the damage was already done. And Stoic had started it. This is all his fault. Hector turned back to the man he used to call his friend and lunged across the table at him, 300 pounds of furious male crashing into 400 pounds of equally furious male. The wooden floor nearly broke when they crashed into it, fists swinging wildly. The remaining adults backed away from the fight in a quick scramble, not wanting to be struck by a wayward fist or boot. Stoic smashed a massive fist into Hector's jaw, knocking the other man off of him and jumped up to his feet. Hector was back on his feet a second later, too, ignoring the ringing in his ears. He swung at Stoic again, landing a gut punch that did almost nothing to the bigger man. "Do you know what you've done?" he cried as he continued to rain punches on Stoic's torso, ignoring the returning ones that pushed him back with each one. "Maybe I just brought the truth to the light," Stoic snarled, already regretting his rash words about Astrid but unable to take them back. He'd never meant to actually dishonor Astrid, he'd just wanted to make Hector hurt the way he did. But he hadn't been thinking clearly, and now everything was a mess. Fuck. All he could do was punch it out with Hector until the other man gave up. So that's what he did. Hector fought until he couldn't stand anymore, falling to his knees as the room spun around him dizzyingly, lip bleeding, both eyes nearly swollen shut, and nose very much broken and also gushing blood. Stoic only had a sore jaw from a lucky punch that he hadn't dodged fast enough. He stood over his ex-friend whose head was hanging on sagging shoulders, panting heavily, the room dead silent. "I'm sorry about what I said about Astrid. It was uncalled for and undeserved. I know she's not a whore, no matter what Olaf said. I'll deal with him," Olaf added. Stoic nodded his thanks to the other man before focusing on his adversary once more. Hector mustered the strength to look up at his chief, wiping at the blood dripping off his chin. "You think that's going to matter? You've all but ruined my daughter. Those boys are never going to leave her alone now. I'll beat anyone who dares molest her to a boneless pulp and then toss them off the island," Stoic vowed, glaring at everyone assembled so they knew to spread the word to their sons. "Whatever," Hector muttered, spitting out blood, staring at Stoic's boots once again. "I'm still not going to give Astrid permission to marry Hiccup. I stand by what I said. I'm sorry you feel that way." Stoic looked down at Hector with sorrow in his eyes, wondering if all of this was his fault. Between Hiccup's belief that he was the laughingstock of the island, and now Hector's statement of rejection, Stoic was finally realizing that maybe he wasn't as good a father as he'd thought he'd been. Is it too late to start teaching Hiccup how to fight? Is there any way I can fix this for him? Maybe, the truth. Hiccup loves her, you know, the giant man said softly. Hector's gaze shot up again as he snorted in disbelief, spraying blood across Stoic's boots, then winced as his nose protested mightily. "Tough. Tell your son to stay away from my daughter or I'm moving my family off this island." Stoic almost said, "You do that," but then he thought of how much Hiccup adored Alga and Astrid and just couldn't do that to his son. He could only hope that with time, maybe he could fix this. So all he growled out past the lump in his throat was, "Fine. And you better tell Astrid to stay away from Hiccup. No point getting his hopes up if you aren't going to approve the match." Hector glared through the slits of his rapidly swelling eyelids. "As I said, I'll die first. Don't tempt me," Stoic snarled before spinning on his heel and stomping out of the tavern before he lost his temper again and flattened Hector into the floor. As he marched up the path to his house, the feelings in Stoic swirled around like a tornado. He was furious with Hector. Furious with himself. And so very ashamed. Why have I never seen that by trying to protect Hiccup, all I've managed to do is hurt him? By preventing him from training with all the other kids, I've singled Hiccup out as different. Weak. Fucking hell, I'm an idiot. But what can I do? I don't want him to fight the dragons. I don't want him to get hurt. Or killed. I can't. I can't lose him too. I just can't. Is it really possible that my tribe won't accept Hiccup as their next chief if he doesn't do the dragon training? Stoic was starting to think it was. And he was beating himself up for it. What kind of future have I been setting my precious son up for? To live a life without a wife or the respect of his tribe, all because I'm worried about losing him. Stopping only feet from his house, Stoic looked up at the partially covered black sky, a star twinkling merrily through the clouds here and there, mocking him. Thor, strike me down now if this is all my fault. He waited, hardly daring to breathe. Nothing. And then, off in the distance, a rumble of thunder filled the air over the sea, sounding like derisive laughter to his ears. Suddenly terrified that Thor was about to judge him for real, Stoic crashed into his home and found Hiccup gazing at Astrid like she'd hung the stars in the sky, and he felt 100 times worse because he'd ruined Hiccup's chance at marrying the best girl on the island. Unfortunately, he took his temper and fears out on the girl in question, because he didn't know what else to do. Get out of my house, Astrid, and never come back, he growled out, hardly able to look at her as he waited impatiently for her to get up from her chair at the table and skedaddle. He couldn't look at Hiccup either, not wanting to see the betrayal he knew would be written all over his face. What? That's not fair! Hiccup exclaimed, shooting up to his feet as Astrid stood and startled sidling towards the door. He followed her, of course, because that's what Hiccup has always done. What has she done to warrant that? Absolutely nothing, Stoic thought. But how can I possibly tell the kids what a fool I've been? And, why the fuck is Hiccup only wearing one boot? I don't have to explain myself, Stoic snarled out, bypassing the boot thing as unimportant, thankful for the adult card that let him get away with such nonsense, even if it was just for the next few minutes. He flinched inwardly at the looks of sheer hurt that the kids gave him, but kept up the glare nevertheless. Astrid finally made it to the other side of the door frame and turned back to look at Hiccup with wide, pain-filled eyes. Stoic couldn't bear to see her looking like that, so he slammed the door in her face and quickly made for his room to escape the inevitable fight he was bound to have with Hiccup over this. What in hell's name was that? I thought you wanted me to court her. Hiccup cried, making Stoic pause mid-step and shrink inside his tunic. Gods! Why did I have to bring that up earlier? Not anymore. Stoic yelled back, never so grateful to see his room in his life. He quickly slammed the door behind him and sagged against it, eventually sliding down the wooden planks to sit with his back against the door. What have I done, Valka? He whispered, a tear escaping despite having the heels of his hands scrunching his eyes closed. Astrid stared at the door in stupefaction. What did I do? Why does Stoic suddenly hate me? What in hell's name was that? I thought you wanted me to court her. Astrid jolted at the words Hiccup yelled loud enough that she could clearly hear them through the thick door. She gasped, hand flying up to cover her mouth. Does that mean that he was pushed into asking me? Gods! Tears suddenly stinging her eyes, she whirled and raced down the path, her fiancé's words haunting Astrid all the way home. Did Hiccup only ask me to marry him because that's what his father wanted? Well, had wanted, anyway. I'm so confused now. She'd thought Hiccup had genuinely loved her, his words and eyes certainly seemed to say so. She'd loved kissing him, snuggling with him. It had been everything she'd ever dreamed it could be. His kisses had been sweet and gentle, and later, just the right amount of forceful to take control without being overbearing. Astrid loved that he'd taken the lead on something, since he usually let her dictate whatever they were doing without a complaint. It had been a nice change and it had made her feel like a girl for once and not just a warrior. It was funny how any sort of attention like that from another boy had never made her feel feminine, but only as an object to be fought over like the best piece of steak on the platter. She'd even let him stick his tongue in her mouth when he'd whispered it over her lips. Playing tongue tag hadn't been anywhere near as revolting as she'd thought it would be. In fact, it had been really hot and she'd started to feel a new kind of heat building in her core that she was only vaguely familiar with. But she knew what it meant. It meant she truly desired Hiccup. Her mother had explained the whole sex thing when she was 12, the conversation of which Astrid had found incredibly uncomfortable to live through, but now Astrid could see how she might actually like the idea of being so intimate with another person. The likes of Ilof and Snotlout most certainly hadn't done it for her. She'd also more or less accidentally noticed that Hiccup had become every bit as excited as Ilof had, but unlike the older boy, Hiccup hadn't pushed himself against her at all, which she was grateful for. She liked kissing him very much, but that didn't mean she wanted to get married and have kids anytime soon. Because that's how it worked for the honorable people on Berk. You pick your mate, get engaged, make out a lot until you're ready to be an adult, get married, make love like bunnies, and then produce a child or two. Theoretically, you could get away with the making love part before the marriage part, but smart girls didn't chance the shame of getting pregnant before they were married. Astrid was a very smart girl. Which brought her back around to her original conundrum: do I still want to marry Hiccup knowing that his father may have pushed Hiccup into asking me? Honestly. Yes. But we're going to have a very serious talk about this. I need to know that marrying me is what he actually wants. Because Thor knows, it's what I want. Eventually. Astrid sighed to herself, kicking a pebble off the path. How can life be so complicated sometimes? A cry of, Hector, from her mother's voice had Astrid paying attention to her surroundings again, finding that she'd walked nearly all the way home without noticing. Seeing a small crowd in her doorway, Astrid jogged past the last couple of houses between her and her house. She found Gobber and Bucket helping her dad into a chair in their living room, her mother hovering at his side and looking about ready to go murder someone. What? Dad, she gasped as she got a good look at her father's face. What in Thor's name happened to you? Had a fight with Stoic, he mumbled. Oh, Dad. Hector. Really? You know Stoic is virtually unbeatable in a fight, Elga said in exasperation as she dabbed at the dried blood on his lip and under his nose. What were you thinking? Gobber and Bucket backed out of the house, looking at each other in alarm. We'll just be going now, Gobber mumbled and then closed the door on what was probably going to be a rather loud discussion about what had happened in the tavern. The Horfusons barely even noticed their leave-taking, too busy staring at each other as they waited for Hector to answer the question. Hector sighed and winced as his ribs protested. Stoic had fists like Mjolnir. I don't think I was, to be honest. I was slightly drunk at the time. Dad. What did you do? Astrid asked worriedly, starting to get an idea that Stoic's proclamation had something to do with this. Hector glanced at his daughter apologetically, since he knew how much she cared for Hiccup as a friend. They had been basically inseparable since they were babies, after all. I may have insulted Hiccup to Stoic's face. Dad. Hector. Hector winced again at the identical-sounding screeches. He rushed to defend himself before he was attacked for slurring their beloved Hiccup's name. Honestly, he had no problem with the boy as a person, he was well-mannered and had spent roughly half his life in their home, making him feel almost like their own child, but that didn't mean he was good enough to marry Astrid. Stoic started it by saying Hiccup was going to marry Astrid. Astrid gaped at her father. How was that worthy of insulting my Hiccup? What's wrong with that? Elga demanded, more or less echoing her daughter's thought. Hiccup's a nice boy. Much nicer than most of the boys on this island, that's for sure. Do I really have to explain it, Elga? Yes, both females said together, making Hector wince again. He was feeling rather ganged up on right now. I essentially told Stoic that I would never let Astrid marry Hiccup because the boy will never be a proper Viking with the way Stoic is overprotecting him, but not quite as nice as that. Oh, Hector, Elga said, shaking her head as she saw Astrid's expression turn furious. That was a mistake. Astrid loves Hiccup. Hector gawked at his daughter, who now had her fists clenched and looked like she wanted to lop off his head with her axe. Is that true? You love that wimp of a boy? Hector oofed as Elga landed a hard punch on his shoulder. He shot her a what was that for look and ended up reeling back at the disappointment on her face. I just can't say anything right today, can I? Why do I have the feeling I'm going to be sleeping on the bench in the living room for the next few days? Astrid just barely fought back tears of hopeless fury. How can you be so stupid, Dad? Of course I love Hiccup. You're the reason Stoic banished me from his house, aren't you? Stoic really did that. Yes, he admitted. But Stoic was right to do so. You're just going to have to get over your crush on Hiccup because I don't want you to have anything further to do with him, do you hear me? It's not a crush, she all but yelled. And you can't stop me from seeing Hiccup if I want to. Hector narrowed his already slitted eyes at his daughter. Oh, yes I can. If I catch you hanging out with Hiccup again, I'm moving this family off the island. Elga gaped at her husband. Astrid was speechless for 10 whole seconds as she stared at him like he'd just slaughtered every human on the island, and then all the animals too, just for the fun of it. I hate you, she hissed, before spinning and running upstairs to her room, gulping back sobs of despair. He almost felt like crying himself, feeling like the world's worst father. Hector, Elga said, shaking her head at him. He held up a hand. Don't start, wife. I'm not changing my mind. I might have to move us anyway because of what Stoic said about Astrid tonight. Looking at her beaten and slumped husband, Elga felt a glimmer of sympathy for him resurface and a small kernel of dread took life in her gut. What did Stoic say about our daughter, Hector? He looked at his wife and shook his head mournfully. It's not good, Elga. Not good at all. 1 minute later, Hector had to stop Elga from going on a rampage to behead both Elof and Stoic. But he almost let her go, because he thought they deserved it. /N, just in case you've been living under a rock and don't know your Norse mythology or watch Marvel movies, Mjolnir is Thor's very large hammer. Tongue-poking smiley. Chapter 9, The Rift, Part 2. Chapter text. The Rift, Part 2. As he stared at his father's closed door, Hiccup's confusion slowly morphed into a fiery anger that lit him up like nothing had ever done before. Being told things like, "No, Hiccup, you can't come on the fishing trip, it's too dangerous," or "No, Hiccup, you can't help with the water brigade, it's too dangerous," were good at inspiring frustration, but he was used to being held back. But this outright banishing of Astrid from his house, and possibly his life. Now that just rubbed him every kind of the wrong way. Hiccup clenched his hands into fists and he narrowed his eyes at the door he wished would magically disappear in an explosion of wooden splinters. How dare he evict the girl I love from our home? How dare he? For the first time in his life, Hiccup felt like a real Viking as he whirled away from the door and literally stomped around the central fireplace, fuming, his thoughts nearly incoherent. Also for the first time in his life. The only jumbled thought that even sort of made sense was the almost overwhelming desire to grab an axe, start hacking at his father's blasted door, and when he was through, start hacking away at his father's overly large and imbecilic head. Not that he could reach that high. But that didn't compute in the moment. Hiccup had made about 10 trips around the fireplace before he noticed that his right foot was starting to sting on the bottom from how hard he was pounding his feet into the stone floor with every step. Why in hell does my foot hurt? He glanced down in confusion and blinked at the wool stocking that covered his foot. A glance to the left showed a brown leather boot. Hiccup pretty much deflated as the sheer absurdity of what he was doing struck him. I'm stomping in one bloody boot. Gods help me, he muttered. Sighing like his favorite pet sheep had just died, not that he'd ever had a pet sheep, but you get the idea. Hiccup shuffled over to the bench and sat, pulling on his boot. Then he let himself fall over backward so his back was on the hard stone and his feet dangled above the floor. Crossing his arms over his chest as if to hold in his thumping heart, Hiccup stared up at the beams of the curved ceiling high above him. Why is life so fucking unfair? What have I ever done to the gods to offend them so? Why am I so much smaller than everybody else my age? Why is my father such a piated, stubborn Viking? Just why? Hiccup huffed out another sigh through pursed lips, making a pffffed sound, and turned his head to the side. A flash of silver caught his eye from further down the bench, making him sit up abruptly. He lunged across the distance and snatched up the skull, cradling it gently in his hands as he settled back down on the bench with his knees drawn up to his chest and his back leaning against the wall. Astrid. Thor, Astrid is the best thing to ever happen to me. Beautiful. Fierce. Smart. Caring. Courageous. Honorable. Like no one else on the island. And she loves me. Me. Only Odin knew why, but Hiccup wasn't going to ask him, just in case the fickle god decided to take even that away from him. He still couldn't believe that she'd kissed him. And that he'd kissed her back. That was the best moment of his life by far. She'd actually been in his arms, draped over his chest, all soft curves and lithe muscles and hard armor. She'd smelled amazing, like lilacs and female. Her soft lips had fit so perfectly to his and her mouth had tasted even better than she smelled, like honey drizzled over fresh bread and something else he had no name for but he wanted more of it. Hiccup closed his eyes as he relived that perfect moment, a muffled groan escaping as a spike of arousal inspired a little twitch of excitement from the mindless appendage inside his trousers. Thor, I want to go find Astrid and kiss her again. Hiccup's eyes popped open. Hang on. There's nothing stopping me from doing just that. Dad's closed door certainly isn't going to do it. Snickering, Hiccup rushed to his feet, pocketing the little skull. He was out the front door in 5 seconds flat, closing it quietly behind him, just in case his father was in a mood to forbid him from talking to Astrid too. With the light of the rising moon as his guide as it peeked through the clouds threatening rain, plus the odd torch lighting the way, he jogged down the path to Astrid's house, anticipation swirling through him at the thought of holding her in his arms again. He was about halfway there when he nearly ran into Gobber, who was coming up the path to get to his place. "Hey, Gobber," he said with a quick smile as he backpedaled and then moved to continue on. Hiccup was pulled to a stop and nearly off of his feet as Gobber caught him by the back of his tunic. "Just a minute, there, Hiccup." The boy caught his balance once again, then turned and gave the long mustachioed man who was essentially an uncle a curious look. "What's up?" Gobber patted him a couple times on the shoulder as he looked down the hill at Astrid's house. "I wouldn't go there if I were you." "What? Why?" Gobber shook his head sadly. "I doubt you'll be very welcome at the moment. You might want to give Hector a couple days to cool off before you go anywhere near Astrid again. And even then, it would probably be best if no one saw you talking to her." Hiccup opened his mouth to ask what in hell's blazes was going on, but Gobber gave him a look of such remorse that it had him snapping his teeth closed as a feeling of absolute dread took over. "I know you two are all but joined at the hip and that there's really nothing that you wouldn't do for each other," Gobber said softly. "But if you value your friendship with Astrid at all, you're going to have to be really careful about things if you don't want to lose her completely." "Gobber, what's going on?" Hiccup said through a throat tight with fear. The big man sighed and shook his head again. "I think you better ask your father that one." "What did he do?" This was forced out through gritted teeth. Hiccup's feeling of dread was quickly morphing back into something even less pleasant. Gobber's head was swaying from side to side once again, a look of sympathy in his eyes that Hiccup was frankly terrified to see. "Honestly, Hiccup, you really don't want to know. It's up to Stoic if he tells you or not." Hiccup's hands clenched into fists again as the earlier feeling of rage fully returned. He glared up the hill towards his house. "Oh, he's going to tell me or he won't like the consequences." His words were a vow. Gobber said, his eyebrows climbing up his forehead at this new hiccup. He watched with incredulous disbelief as the usually happy-go-lucky boy started up the path, stomping all the way, and muttering curse words that actually made him blink in shock as they floated on the air back to him. "Hun. I guess there is some Stoic in there," Gobber muttered to the electrified air. "Who'da thunk it?" The clouds rumbled above as if to say, "I did. And I approve." Gobber glanced up and smiled. "Well, if that's your opinion, who am I to argue? Watch over the boy, will you?" A bolt of lightning flashed horizontally across the sky above the ocean, looking like a godly grin. The blacksmith grinned back and then started hobbling up the path again. "Thank you, Thor." Hiccup did his own impersonation of a pissed-off polar bear, although more of a cub than a full-grown male, as he slammed his way into his home. He was still muttering curse words as he grabbed an axe hanging on the wall just to the left of the door and then continued his stomp to his father's door. And then he swung. Stoic heaved a sigh when he heard the outside door crash open, assuming that Hiccup had left in a huff. His eyes nearly popped out of his head when a recognizable-sounding thwack hit the door just above his head, making the entire door shudder. Stoic leapt to his feet and stared at the door with wide eyes, seriously unable to believe that someone was attacking his door with an axe. And with a respectable amount of force, no less. And that someone may in fact be his minuscule son, Hiccup. The following words bellowed through the wood confirmed his incredulous suspicion. "Dad. Get your massive ass out here this instant and tell me what in Odin's name you've done." This was emphasized by another thwack on the door about halfway up. To Stoic's amazement, this actually caused the wood on his side to splinter a bit. "Holy crap on yak. My son is actually acting like a Viking. I don't know if I should be proud or alarmed." Recovering from his shock, Stoic unlatched the door and swung it inwards, causing his son to hop after it as he'd had one foot on the door to brace against it as he tried to pull the axe out of the wood. Stoic grabbed the axe near the head and yanked it out of the wood, lifting it up, teenage boy and all. He glared at his son, because, proud or not, he was still the chief and this wasn't exactly permissible behavior towards one's chief. And he said my ass was massive. My ass isn't massive. It's everything above it that is. Hiccup let go, dropping down to the floor. "What is the meaning of this?" Stoic growled as he tossed the axe off to the side, uncaring that it crashed into his wardrobe. Hiccup almost shriveled up under the heavy weight of his father's furious gaze, but he was still on his own rage high and he wasn't quite ready to let it go. He stiffened his shoulders and glared right back, wishing he was twice as tall so he could look his father in the eye and have a proper nose-to-nose stare-off. "What is the meaning of this?" he asks. Hiccup smirked in sheer exasperation, rolling his eyes towards the heavens. He focused on his father again. "What is the meaning of this?" "I'll tell you what this is. This is me at the end of my rope with you, Dad." He nearly spit the name. "This is me demanding answers." Stoic wasn't pleased with the temper tantrum, but there was a little part of him was still amazed and more than a little proud that his son was actually standing up to him. "Answers for what? I told you I don't have to explain myself." "Seriously?" Hiccup cried. "You're seriously just going to ignore the fact that you tossed my intended out of our house? You're seriously going to ignore the fact that you've done only Thor knows what so that I'm not welcome in the Horferson house either? What the fucking hell did you do, you oversized Neanderthal?" Hiccup actually stomped his foot and poked his father in the chest, he was so livid. Stoic's eyes nearly bulged out of his head once again as his son said a vulgar word he didn't even know that Hiccup knew. And what the fuck is a Neanderthal? His son had never had a temper before. Hardly ever cursed. And he most certainly didn't glare down his father like he was possessed by Tyr. Stoic's pride in his son grew, but it still wasn't to be borne. "What did you say to me?" Stoic bellowed. "Oh." Hiccup gulped, sense finally returning to him. "Nothing," he hedged, backing up a couple of steps. Stoic grabbed a handful of Hiccup's tunic before he could get away, lifting him up by it so they were eye to eye. "Gods, he's so light still. I swear my axe still weighs more." He narrowed his eyes at his now cringing son. The wincing fear made Stoic hate himself in that moment. Shit. It's not like I'm actually going to beat him, he knows that. Doesn't he? "It didn't sound like nothing to me, but I'm going to pretend it was," he said with a snarl, then dropped the boy and turned away, like he couldn't bear to look at him anymore. "And only because I owe you." Hiccup sucked in a huge gulp of air, certain that his dad had been about to wallop him halfway across the house. He was quite relieved that he didn't. "You're not going to tell me what you did, are you?" Hiccup said softly to his father's expansive back. Stoic scrubbed a hand over his face and huffed out an exasperated breath. The desolate tone in Hiccup's voice was killing him. He looked at the painting of Valka that was hanging over his bed with sorrowful eyes, wishing she was here with every ounce of his being. Her eyes seemed to look back at him accusingly, but somehow understandingly as well. Without turning around, he said, "I got in a fight with Hector and some unintentional words were said. Just stay away from Astrid for the time being until I can fix this. That's all you need to know." Hiccup stared at his father's slumped shoulders as his clever mind read between the lines and came up with a logical deduction. "You said something bad about Astrid because Hector said something derogatory about me, didn't you?" Stoic slumped just a little bit more. "Maybe. Tell me." "You don't want to know." That's what Hiccup was afraid of. And simply by that, he had a good idea of just how bad this was. There was only one thing you can truly hurt a girl's reputation with, and that was her chastity or lack thereof. Gods, I might actually hate him for this. "I can't believe you," he whispered, chest literally clamping around his lungs as he realized just how much his father had ruined tonight. "I'll be lucky if Hector doesn't move his family to a different tribe from a slur like that. Fuck. My son is too smart for his own good sometimes." Stoic turned around slowly, like his feet were weighed down by boulders. "I'm sorry, Hiccup." Hiccup scoffed. "You're sorry? You're sorry? Thor, Dad. I finally work up the courage to tell Astrid I love her and ask her to marry me, and you're sorry? Are you that determined to ruin my life completely? She was the only good thing I had. The only thing." The biting words nearly broke Stoic's heart. Trying to defend himself, and maybe wanting Hiccup to share his pain, Stoic said, "Hector wasn't going to let you marry her anyway." Hiccup gasped. In 5 seconds flat, he was on the verge of exploding again. "And whose fault is that?" "For foo. Frig's sake, Dad. You're the one who wouldn't let me train like all the other kids. You're the one who doesn't take me on fishing trips. You're the one who has me hide like a coward every time a dragon so much as flies past the island. Hiccup gave his father his best death glare and said very softly and very clearly. All of this is your fault and I don't think I'll ever forgive you for it. Stoic literally sagged in his boots as Hiccup spun on his heel and climbed up the stairs to his room. He followed, watching his son's retreating form with stinging eyes. Hiccup. There was no answer. Please, Hiccup. I'll train you. Teach you to fight. We'll change Hector's mind. There was still no answer from above, but Stoic could hear the sound of movement up there. He watched the stairs with worried eyes and waited. Hiccup couldn't believe what he'd heard, and a little part of him rejoiced at finally getting his father to admit that he was wrong. But it wasn't enough to change how very betrayed he felt. He continued packing his bag, throwing in his drawings and sketching supplies and his extra clothes. Then he scooped up his pillow and fur blanket and marched down the stairs. Stoic's already fractured heart broke even further when he saw everything his son was carrying. Where are you going? He choked out quietly. Hiccup met his father's eyes steadily from the last step. I don't know yet. Maybe the woods. Maybe Gobber's shop. I'm ashamed to call you my father right now and I can't bear to stay in this house with you. If you were serious about allowing me to train, then I'll ask Gobber to teach me. He wasn't going to get Astrid in trouble by admitting that she'd been helping him train for years. I don't want anything else to do with you right now. Hiccup. Please. No. I'm done, Dad. Just done. Stoic couldn't meet those accusing green eyes that were so much like own anymore. I am sorry, Hiccup. I was wrong. About everything. Hiccup almost changed his mind when he saw how defeated his father looked, but the loss of Astrid was enough to drive him on. He walked all the way to the door before he said over his shoulder, yes. You were. Then he left. Stoic collapsed onto the bottom step, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time since the memorial for his beloved wife, he cried. Hiccup trudged further up the hill, away from the village. He wasn't kidding when he thought he might stay in the woods. If the storm came any closer, it would probably chase him back to Gobber's shop, but for now, all he wanted was to be alone. Going into the village was just asking to be made fun of and bullied and he honestly couldn't stomach the idea of it anymore. He correctly assumed that his father's fight with Hector had taken place in the tavern, which meant that the entire village would know what had happened by now. Aside from Astrid, Alga, Gobber, and maybe Fishlegs, Hiccup doubted there was one other person down there who would be able to resist taunting him with his undesirableness as a son-in-law. He honestly thought that if he knew how to sail, he'd probably go jump in a boat and find a new island to live on. I might do it anyway, if Astrid leaves for good. At that point, he wouldn't care if the perils of the ocean prevailed. With every heavy step into the dark landscape, Hiccup turned off his emotions until he was just numb. He didn't want to rage. He didn't want to cry. He most certainly didn't want to feel the guilt that was starting to eat at him for some of the things he'd said to his father. Numb felt good. Numb he could deal with. He walked and walked until he was past the livestock pastures and then walked some more, aiming for the far side of the island, wanting to get as far away from his problems as he could. The dark didn't bother him, having lived in a land that was cursed with no sun at all for 2 weeks of the year for his entire life, he was used to it. And the rumbles of thunder and lightning from over the ocean seemed like a fitting background tribute to his mood. There was just enough hints of moonlight filtering through the thinner clouds above Burke and through the thick treetops to see the darker shadows that were the tree trunks and various other obstacles such as rocks, so he didn't run into them. Eventually, a soft, repetitive, thunking sound registered between the rumbles of thunder, making Hiccup pay more attention to where he was going. Curious, he walked towards the noise. When it paused for a minute he did too, needing the sounds to follow. They picked up again and Hiccup walked faster. As he grew closer to the familiar thunking noise, a new sound became audible. It sounded like the sniffles and gasps of someone crying really hard even though they didn't want to. Who would be out here, crying and assaulting the trees? Oh. Astrid. Picking up a jog, Hiccup soon broke into a small clearing filled with moonlight as the clouds suddenly decided to part. And in the clearing, he saw the back of a blonde goddess poised to throw a dagger at a tree that already had a dozen sharp blades in it, buried to the hilt. His heart practically leapt out of his thin chest with joy and relief before it clenched with sympathy as another choked sob was wrenched from her. Astrid, he breathed. Thank you, Thor, for bringing us back together. I'm here. /N, Tyr is the Norse god of war. Frigg is the goddess of marriage and Odin's wife. Chapter 10, Tears, Kisses, and a Flying Sheep. Chapter text. Tears, Kisses, and a Flying Sheep. Astrid was only a step away from her bedroom door when the guilt over what she'd said to her father froze her feet. I don't hate him. I could never hate him. Roll my eyes right out of my head, exasperated with him. Yes. He is a Viking male after all and suffers from idiotitis, just like all the other Viking males. But I'll never hate my father. I love him. He's a good dad. He provides for the family. Is one of the best warriors on the island. Is really good to mom to the point of embarrassing situations. And best of all, he takes care of me but doesn't coddle me. He lets me be the warrior I was destined to be, small female or not. Astrid swiped at the tears leaking from her eyes with a frustrated hand. Gods, what a mess. She was still beyond angry with her father for forbidding her to see Hiccup anymore, but she also couldn't leave him thinking that she hated him for real. Her dad looked like he'd taken enough of a beating tonight as is. She spun back around and was a quarter of the way down the stairs when her parents' conversation floated up to her and she froze again, her hand going to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Didn't mean it, but Stoic implied that the reason that Astrid is so popular with the boys is because she was being loose with her favors. He did what? Astrid would have seconded her mother's screech if she wasn't in such shock. Why would Stoic say such a thing? Oh. Right. Dad insulted Hiccup first. And Vikings are firm believers in the eye for an eye mentality. That didn't excuse it by any stretch of the imagination, but she could see how a somewhat drunk Stoic could have blurted out such a stupid thing. Her father's next words almost sent Astrid into her own Viking rage. That's not the worst part, he said gravely. It's not. How could it not? Ilof, that dunder-headed son of Odin, jumped up and confirmed it, saying that he and his buddies had all had her. There was a few seconds of stunned silence as Astrid felt herself heat with a rage like she'd never felt before. And then her mother expressed the same rage, her voice deadly. I'll kill him. I'll kill them both. Berk is going to need a new chief and that overgrown baby is going to regret ever saying such a thing about Astrid if it's the last thing I do. Mom's going to have to get in line, because Ilof's last minutes on this earth are numbered. She spun back around on the stairs and ran to her room and geared up for war. Her battle axe went in the sheath across her back and she slipped the leather cross strap that held her set of matching throwing daggers over her head. And for good measure, even though it wasn't her preferred weapon anymore, she belted on her old sword. When she stomped her way back into the living area, she found her father holding her mother back from leaving with a hand gripped around her wrist. Her mother still looked murderous and she had her axe in hand. Let me go. I can't let you do it, sweetness. You have to see that. Stoic may be an idiot, but he's our chief, so that's out. And you can't murder that little misbegotten pile of yak dung, no matter how much I'd love to let you. His father promised to deal with him. And Stoic said he'd beat to a pulp anyone who dared to proposition Astrid and then kick them off the island. Her mother sighed, some of the fire leaving her as she slumped slightly. Fine, but they better watch it, or I will find a way to make sure a dragon eats them the next time there's an attack. Hector laughed as he pulled her away from the front door and back to the chair so he could sink back into it gratefully. I might even help you. At this point, Alga's awareness of her surroundings returned and she realized that Astrid was standing at the bottom of the stairs, wearing every weapon she owned as far as she could tell. Oh dear. Hector turned his head as well, and he sighed. You heard. Astrid nodded once. I did. I can't let you go out and kill them either. Astrid huffed, blowing her bangs up before they settled back over her left eye. She crossed her arms over her chest. Fine, she muttered petulantly. I'm sorry, baby, Hector said softly. Astrid shot him a look as she walked across the living space towards the front door. You better be sorry, she wanted to yell at him. This was all your fault after all. But she kept that inside, not wanting to get into a screaming match with her father right now. Instead, she managed to keep it to a slightly more civilized, "I'm sure you are. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm still royally pissed off at you." Hector narrowed his eyes at her tone, but decided to let it slide. Astrid had had enough for one night. "Where do you think you're going?" he said, stiffly rising back to his feet. Astrid paused with her hand on the door. "Target practice. In the dark. With a storm on the horizon. The moon's out above Birkstill." "Sort of." Hector growled, but conceded she needed an outlet to vent on. "Fine. But no Hiccup. And don't go seeking out Elof either. You can use him for target practice tomorrow if he gives you any more trouble." Astrid looked over her shoulder at him as she opened the door. "Deal." She took one step out, eyes on the pathway in front of their house before she quietly said, "And I don't hate you," before she quickly closed the door behind her. Hector and Alga stared at the closed door for a minute of silence before he sank back into the chair again, pulling his beautiful blonde wife into his lap and winding his arms around her. She dropped the axe on the floor and wrapped her arms around his back, snuggling her head into his shoulder. Resting his chin on her head, he huffed softly. "Do you think she's going to be okay?" "I think Astrid is always going to be okay in the end. Our daughter is strong, Hector. Even stronger than people give her credit for." Hector closed his eyes and absorbed the comfort his wife provided him with. "I hope you're right, because I have a feeling it's not going to be easy for her for the next little while until things settle down again. Gods, I want to chop off Elof's prick and feed it to him," he added under his breath. Alga snorted out a giggle, looking up at him as she pushed one of his many braids behind his ear that had escaped the leather tie holding them all back, trailing her fingers gently over his battered face. "Did you ever stop to wonder what inspired Elof to slur Astrid so?" Hector shook his head, raising a brow. Alga smiled slyly. "I bet you anything Astrid already fed Elof his manhood and he didn't like how it tasted." Hector barked out a laugh. "Thor's nose, you're probably right." Her grin widened. "Theoretically speaking, of course, 'cause I'm sure he'd be a puddle of bawling baby if she actually had." "There's always tomorrow," Hector said eagerly. "I would even pay to see it." Alga laughed, a hint of anger and determination making it a little bitter sounding. "Yes, there's always tomorrow." Astrid ran up the path that wound through the village and up the hill, ignoring the thump of her sword against her leg with every step. If she couldn't go murder someone, she wanted to get as far away from everyone as she could get so she didn't give in to the temptation of turning right back around and aiming for Elof's house. She had every intention of calling him out, but she'd wait until tomorrow. Better to do it when the whole village can see me hand him his head on a platter anyway. She paused in her flight as she passed Hiccup's house, wishing with everything she had that she could talk to him. She could really use some comfort right now and he was the only one she wanted giving it to her. As she stared at the door in longing, "What did you say to me?" was bellowed from within in Stoic's very angry-sounding voice, practically making the shingles bounce on the roof. Astrid nearly jumped out of her skin. "Holy Thor, what is going on in there? Is Hiccup actually fighting with his dad?" As far as she knew, Hiccup had never fought with his father. She was pretty sure Hiccup would have mentioned it if he had. She waited for another half a minute, straining her ears to hear past the distant rumbles of thunder and the wind that played with the loose strands of her hair. She was tempted to go press her ear against the door, but refrained even though she hadn't heard anything else from where she stood. Dying of curiosity, but knowing that interfering would be a very bad idea, Astrid sighed and continued on past the last house at the top of the hill. She'd ask Hiccup the next time she saw him about what had happened. Assuming I ever get to see Hiccup again, that is. A gasping inhale and an unwanted tear emerged at the thought. She wiped it away and picked up her pace again into a fast jog, in the vain effort of outrunning her sorrow. But with every step of her flight that had her running with ever swifter steps through the dark, the reality of her situation caught up to her even faster. "Thor help me, I might never see Hiccup again. Dad might make me move off the island. The whole town now thinks I'm a whore." Probably not even a fraction of them, but she was losing the ability to think rationally at an exponential rate. Gods! They are probably gossiping about me right now. Astrid's heart beat frantically as she gasped for air, screams bottling up in her throat as choking sobs took precedence. She barely noticed that she had passed the yak pasture and was headed into the forest due to the blurring of her vision from the tears that were now streaming down her face. Instinct made her slow enough so she didn't bounce off a tree, but that was as far as it came towards paying attention to where she was going. Astrid ran until she was shaking with the effort of trying to breathe through clogged sinuses, cry, and run at the same time. When she stumbled into a small grassy clearing, her legs gave out and she fell to her knees. She lost track of how long she knelt there, having a very uncharacteristic pity cry, but she did notice when the pity slowly morphed into anger. Still crying, because she couldn't seem to stop, as if 14 years worth of held-back tears had decided to all emerge at once, she rose back to her feet as she grabbed her axe off her back and threw it with all her might at the first tree she saw through her tears, screaming incoherently to the heavens as she did so. It landed with a satisfying thunk and Astrid imagined it was Olaf's head that had just been split like a melon. Thor, that felt good. Swiping at her tears with the back of an arm so she could see a little better, she then threw her daggers at another tree, one after the other, as hard as she could, a mental image of Olaf's sneering face inspiring extra force. When they were all gone, including the one from her boot and the new one from Hiccup that had been in her arm wrap, Astrid unsheathed her sword and swung at a nearby bush, hacking at it until it was little more than twigs and fallen leaves. Chest heaving with effort, and those stupid tears that wouldn't stop still messing with her vision, Astrid dropped her sword and stumbled over to the tree full of daggers and yanked them out, holding as many in her left hand as she could before she was forced to sheath at least half of them. Then she spun and found another tree to target and let loose with the first dagger. She was on round 3 of dagger impaling of what was now Stoic's imaginary head when she heard her name called out in a barely audible tone behind her. Astrid spun, saw Hiccup, dropped the dagger from suddenly nerveless fingers, and literally bolted at him. Hiccup dropped his bedding and opened his arms just in time to catch the Astrid-shaped missile as she ran into him. He staggered back and ended up sitting on the ground, but he didn't let go of her as she buried her face in his chest, held him tighter than was comfortable, and proceeded to cry her heart out into his tunic. The occasional hiccup that she managed to mumble out between sobs made him feel like the only male on the planet as he shared her sorrow and basked in the fact that he was the one she chose to be comforted by. He put his cheek on top of her head and whispered soothing nonsense to her as he stroked her hand down her hair in a repetitive motion meant to calm. Her tears were breaking his heart because he'd never seen her cry before. Ever. Not even when she'd dislocated her shoulder in a wrestling match or split her forehead open after falling out of a tree. She still had the scar from that one, hidden under her headband. He had seen her sad a few times, to be sure, like when her mother had a miscarriage at 3 months pregnant when they were 10, or when her grandmother died, but this was a whole other level of sorrow that Hiccup could barely comprehend. When she was still crying 5 minutes later, Hiccup was starting to get scared. Needing her to stop and be the strong Astrid that he knew once again, he tried talking to her for real. Astrid. Sweetheart. Please stop crying. It's going to be okay. We'll get through this. I'll figure something out. I won't let those idiots separate us, even if I have to follow you to whatever tribe you end up with and hide nearby. Please, Astrid. Please stop crying. I love you. You're my everything and it's killing me to see you so sad. Astrid didn't know what was wrong with her. There shouldn't be any water left in her body to expel through her eyes. But the tears just kept coming. She felt like she was being drained from the inside out. She tried to get control, she really did, but it wasn't until he said he'd follow her anywhere and that he loved her that the tap in her eyes finally slowed down. Her sobs turned to hiccups and then to quiet panting breaths that eventually steadied into normal breathing. Hiccup sighed in relief when her sobbing stopped and her arms relaxed their vice grip on him, kissing the top of her head gratefully. There now. It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay. Astrid echoed his sigh and moved her cheek to a dry section of tunic, which ended up putting her ear over his heart. She listened to the steady thump-thump, thinking the sound was incredibly comfortingly. Tingling in her legs made her aware that she was crumpled up nearly painfully on the ground and she shifted into a more comfortable half-kneel, sort of lying on her hip. But she didn't move her head. She liked where it was. But she did take a quick swipe at her face to clean off the snot and tears before wrapping her arm around his back again. They sat in silence for a while before Astrid worked up the courage to tilt her head up and look at him. I'm sorry. I just cried an ocean on you. Hiccup smiled softly, brushing her sweaty bangs off to the side so he could see both of her beautiful eyes that looked midnight blue in the moonlight that had chosen to stick around. The thunder rumbles had faded away as well, he realized belatedly. Don't worry about it. I'm sure this tunic needed washing anyway. You just gave it its first rinse, is all he joked. Astrid smiled as she sat up and punched him in the shoulder lightly. Hiccup heaved a long-suffering sigh, hiding a grin at her standard display of affection as he jokingly rubbed the spot like it ached. What was that one for? For being you. She leaned closer and kissed him quickly, blushing lightly. And that's for being you, too. He said smirking, burying his face in the crook of her neck and pressing a kiss to her soft skin, happily breathing in her somewhat salty female scent. I think I like being me right now. You should, Astrid said on a giggle as his lips traveled up her neck, tickling her lightly and sending tiny shivers through her. She sobered and pulled away again slightly, her eyes looking mournful once more. I'm not so sure I like being myself at the moment, though. Hiccup was afraid of where she was going with this, and her sudden change of attitude brought his hopes of another make-out session crashing back to earth. He knew that was selfish though, and pushed his own desires off to the side for her. Because of what my father said about you. I had a fight with him about that, by the way, he added quickly, so she knew he was on her side. Yes, sort of. And I think I heard a bit of that fight on my way by your house. Astrid huffed a sigh, pulling away completely and leaned back on her hands, looking up at the moon that was a good 3/4 full in the now nearly cloudless black sky. The wind that whispered through the treetops had chased them off quickly. How much do you know? Hiccup grabbed his pillow and put it behind her and then folded up his blanket and made another pillow for himself. He talked as he worked. Not much. I did get him to admit that he said something he shouldn't have about you and I guessed the rest. He shrugged off the bag of stuff that he'd been carrying and lay back on his folded blanket, looking up at the moon too. This was a delicate subject and neither had the courage to look at each while they talked about it, but both knew it needed to be said. Astrid looked back at the feather-stuffed pillow, shooting him a grateful look, before she reclined backwards as well. That lasted for all of 5 seconds before she abruptly sat back up and unbuckled her belts, tossed off the axe and dagger carriers that were crisscrossed over her chest and back, and then removed her spiked shoulder pauldrons. Then she lay back down, sighing in relief at how much more comfortable that was. She suddenly felt completely exhausted and just wanted to curl up and sleep for a week. Her left hand reached over and grabbed Hiccup's hand that was resting on his stomach, wanting to touch him and needing the human contact more than anything. He squeezed her hand gently and laced their fingers together before resting their joined hands back on his stomach. Hiccup waited patiently for her to talk, sensing that she was working up the courage to do so. Astrid turned her head slightly, watching Hiccup stare up at the sky from her peripheral vision. In the dark, his profile stood out palely, reminding her once again of how cute he was. His nose was a tiny bit too big for his face, but she had a feeling he'd grow into it. And his pointed jawline looked just as nibble-worthy as ever. Soon, she promised herself. I've been silent long enough. And he's been very patient. As always. Taking in one final steadying breath, Astrid told what she knew. My dad was all but carried home and he looks like he got in a fight with a Gronkel and lost. He admitted that he said something insulting about you after Stoic said you were going to marry me, which caused your dad to say something insulting about me in return. Note to self, must remember to come back to the marriage thing. I have a bone to pick with him about that one. Oh, boy. Astrid shot him a grateful look from under her bangs at his exasperated tone on her behalf. Your dad apparently implied that because I was always surrounded by boys trying to impress me and win my hand in marriage, that I was being loose with my virtue. He turned his head and looked at her with remorse all over his face. I knew it. I knew Dad had blown it big time by how he acted. I'm so sorry, Astrid. So very very sorry. He raised their joined hands and kissed the top of hers. Astrid melted at how sweet he was. His support made her feel a million times better, helping her realize that the rest of the village could hang themselves for all she cared. Hiccup's good opinion was all she needed. Hiccup continued. I wish I could beat him up for you. I did take an axe to his door, if that helps. Astrid's eyes widened. You didn't. I did. Hiccup looked pretty proud of himself and Astrid thought it was rightly so. Astrid smiled at him widely. Look who's showing his Viking side. I'm impressed. Hiccup felt his face heat at the praise, and was grateful it was dark out so she, probably, couldn't see. So. I hate to ask this, cause I know you, and I know that what you've said so far isn't enough to turn you into a watering pot. You'd just glare at or beat up anyone who tried to insult you to your face. Is there more that I don't know? He was right, of course. If that was all there was to it, Astrid wouldn't have broken down. Yes. Unfortunately. The worst part was when my dad said I could never see you again, and if I did, he'd move us off the island. Hiccup gasped. He'd sort of implied that the Horfusons might move, but not because of him. Thor, Astrid. How are we supposed to work with that? She shook her head on her pillow, eyes stinging once again as she stared blindly at the moon. I don't know. Hiccup's brow furrowed in frustration. I'm sure we'll figure something out. He let the silence broken only by the sound of the wind and the nighttime insects talking to each other sit heavily around them for a minute. There's something else, isn't there? Astrid nodded slowly, still staring up at the sky, not knowing for sure if he was watching her to see the movement or not, but assuming he was. After your dad's slur on my honor, Ilof added his confirmation, saying that he and the other older boys had all had me. I guess he didn't like being turned down again at the point of his own dagger, she whispered with false humor. Hiccup blinked once before he was beset by conflicting emotions of rage and sympathy. He more or less growled in his chest, not even knowing he could make such a sound. Oh, sweetheart. Using their joined hands, he tugged her over to him and wrapped his arm around her in a hug. He's a yaks behind and I'm sure most people know it. You know I'd kill him for you if that's what you want. Not sure how I'll pull that off, but I'm sure I can come up with something diabolical and fitting to avenge my Astrid. Astrid smiled as she snaked her free arm under Hiccup's shoulders and returned his hug. Thank you, babe, but I can take care of the walking ass myself. Besides, you'd have to get in line behind my parents. Hiccup chuckled and kissed her forehead. Well, if you're sure. I'm sure. Ilof and I are going to have a lovely talk tomorrow in front of the whole tribe. I can guarantee he's not going to like it. He snorted. I'm sure he won't. He rubbed her back absently. Are you okay now? I promise I won't let your father separate us entirely. Astrid slid up a bit and kissed his jaw softly. Yeah. I'm good now. I'm okay with us meeting out here whenever we can both sneak away at the same time, if you want. Hiccup was getting lost in the sensations of having her breasts pressed to his chest and her soft lips whispering against his skin as she talked, but he managed to keep enough of his brain power to answer her. Oh, I want. But I won't have to do much sneaking. I was kind of planning to live out here in the woods for a while. I can't stand to be anywhere near my father right now. Hiccup, she whined softly. You can't. Winter will show up anytime and you'll freeze. He cupped her cheek with his warm hand. I know. I'll sleep in the smithy when it gets too cold. Don't worry. That's all right, then she breathed, getting lost in the dark depths of his eyes as he gazed at her longingly. Astrid realized their mouths were only a breath away from touching and she felt her own wave of longing sweep over her. She closed that last minuscule amount of space and pressed her lips to his in a tentative kiss, the hand behind his shoulders moving up to bury in his soft hair. Their joined hands were still trapped between their chests and she tugged her fingers free so she could cup his cheek in return. Hiccup's now free hand found its way to her back and he pressed her closer as their gentle kiss grew in confidence and passion. He licked her bottom lip, asking entrance again like earlier, and groaned happily when she opened slightly. But this time, instead of him seeking out her tongue, hers emerged and pushed his back into his mouth to duel playfully in his space. Astrid writhed slightly, rubbing her suddenly sensitive torso against the hard surface of his chest. Kissing him seemed to just get better and better the more they did it and she never wanted it to end. But need for some quick gasps of air had her pulling back and running her lips and teeth over his jawline like she'd imagined doing earlier. Hiccup seemed to like that, because he moaned softly in her ear. You have a very sexy jaw, she whispered boldly, moving closer to his ear. I was all he could come up with. All of the blood in his brain had officially run south, and Hiccup was close to babbling incoherently, ready to beg her to press her wonderful mouth all over him. Literally. Please. Ba-a-a-a-a-a. They broke apart, starting at each other in surprise. What was that? Astrid asked. Ba-a-a-a-a. They looked up, since the sound seemed to be coming from above them. They shared blinking looks of shock as a bleating sheep appeared to be flying above the trees all by itself. What the? Hiccup said, sitting up quickly as soon as Astrid did. Ba-a-a-a-a. And then the sheep crossed in front of the moon. It effectively disappeared, and an outline of a flying dragon neither of them had ever seen before was clear to see for 2 whole seconds before it vanished again and only the sheep was visible. Ba-a-a-a. And then even the sheep disappeared from sight as the trees blocked their view. Astrid and Hiccup stared at each other with wide eyes for a full minute before Hiccup blurted out, "Did you see that?" "I saw it. But I don't believe it." Astrid shook her head slowly. "Was that a black dragon?" Hiccup said. "Or was I seeing it wrong?" "No. You didn't see it wrong." Astrid looked up at the sky again, fruitlessly. "That was definitely a black dragon. And the only black dragon I know of is a..." She paused, not even sure if she should say it. The mythical dragon was said to be the deadliest dragon alive, but no one in their tribe or any of the nearby tribes had seen one to confirm it. Hiccup finished her sentence for her, or in his tone and his eyes still wide with wonder at the somehow beautiful creature he'd seen. A Night Fury. Chapter 11, An Experiment in Human Mating Rituals. Chapter text. An Experiment in Human Mating Rituals. Ba-a-a-a-a. Toothless bent his head down as he flapped his wings to gain some height over the trees and glared at the woolly white sheep that he'd just snatched from a flock of the stupid creatures. The sheep ignored him. Ba-a-a-a-a. He growled at it. Ba-a-a-a-a. What is wrong with this stupid sheep? It was perplexing the dragon to no end because they were almost always silent with fright when in the clutches of his claws. Quiet, he thought at the verbose pain in his ears. Ba-a-a-a-a. I said shut it. Ba-a-a-a-a. Don't make me kill you. Ba-a-a-a-a. The warning fell on an oblivious mind, making Toothless snarl at his queen's intended dinner. She preferred her offerings still alive and warm, but there was no way Toothless was listening to that obnoxious bleating all the way to her island. Ba-a-a. He shifted his grip on the sheep and crushed its neck, making it fall limp in his claws. Toothless sighed in relieved remorse. He always felt bad about the fate of these poor fluffy idiots. Black dragon I know of is a Night Fury. What the? Toothless paused in mid-flight, hovering on the spot as his head swung back the way he'd come, ears twitching at the human voices. Gronkle droppings. I've been spotted. In a year's worth of nightly raids, that had never happened. What are humans doing in the forest at this time of night? And so far from their village of strange-looking dwellings. Now slightly panicked, he flew back on silent wings to investigate, ears straining for the next words. He dipped below the tree line, then landed entirely to drop his dead annoyance on the forest floor. Toothless hesitated as he slunk through the trees on silent pause, changing his direction slightly as he followed the sound of the female voice, the evening bugs quieting as they sensed a predator in their midst. Do you think we should tell the village? No. Bad idea. I don't know, a young male voice replied. Would they even believe us? I'd rather not find out. There is the strong possibility they would think we were making it up to take attention away from everything that happened tonight. Now Toothless was curious. What? What happened tonight? Is something going on in the human village that is actually interesting? He and Luna had occasionally spied on them for something to do, but they'd found their routines to be rather monotonous after a while. And they were loud and obnoxious to listen to for the most part, often rhapsodizing on their dragon kills, or whining about their livestock being stolen and having to rebuild their houses all the time due to fire issues. There is that. Not to mention the small problem that we could not corroborate each other's sighting because we're not supposed to see each other. The young male huffed out a more audible than normal breath, and silence reigned for half a minute as Toothless finally crept up to the clearing the humans were in. He got his first look at the 2 humans who had spotted him, undoubtedly because of that stupid sheep. They were young humans, both small and slender in comparison to the vast majority of the other humans on this island. Toothless wondered if he should permanently silence them before they could give away his presence, but found he really didn't have the stomach for outright murder when they hadn't actually done anything to warrant it. Yet. "Can you imagine the prestige if we brought down a Night Fury?" the female said excitedly. Toothless snorted quietly to himself in amusement. "As if that tiny little human is capable of taking me down." The young male obviously thought so as well, for he laughed in a disbelieving way. "Like that would ever happen. We couldn't even see it except for when it crossed the moon. And I didn't hear anything but the sheep. It's silent and invisible in the night. You'd have nothing to aim at." Toothless smiled in approval at the smart boy. "Perhaps not all humans are a blight on the surface of the earth." The girl crossed her arms over her chest and glared at the boy. "Leave me some fantasies, hiccup." The boy raised his hands in surrender. Sure. Sure. If anyone could catch themselves a Night Fury, it would be you anyway." Toothless rolled his eyes. "Never going to happen. She'd be better off setting her sights on a Gronkle. They're slow and not the brightest dragons out there." Apparently the boy's words were enough to calm her mild ire, for her glower cleared and she smiled at him brightly. "And that's one of the reasons why I love you, you're very good at flattery." Toothless huffed in silent laughter. The boy really was a smart one if he'd already mastered the fine art of mollifying a temperamental female. He had gone through his own trial and error period when it came to saying the correct things to Luna. The worst error being when he'd once tried to give her a compliment in the form of comparing her scales to the beauty of glistening snow. Just, not quite that poetically because he'd gotten all flustered by her big blue eyes, but the intent was there. It had come out sounding more like, "Luna, you're like snow. I mean, your body is like snow. I mean, ugh, you glisten. Yeah. That's it." Somehow, she'd taken that as an insult to her warmth and she didn't speak to him for 2 whole days, demonstrating just how cold she could be. The scrawny boy flushed, his body temperature visibly rising in Toothless infrared-based night vision as he stammered and made pathetic attempts at coming up with an appropriate response to the girl's declaration and compliment. Toothless could definitely sympathize. The one with the strange name of Hiccup, as if Toothless was any better, was still stammering when the girl stepped forward and forcibly quieted him by grabbing his upper body covering and pressing her mouth to his. Toothless had seen this act before, but he'd never quite understood why humans would do such a strange thing. Wouldn't it make more sense to simply say "shut up"? As the 2 young humans continued to press their mouths together, their arms wrapped around each other and their jaws moved as they apparently used their tongues too. And noises of pleasure were starting to emerge from them. As heated pheromones started to waft through the air, Toothless quickly came to the conclusion that mouth touching was more than just a shut-up gesture. In fact, he was getting decidedly uncomfortable as he realized this was some form of mating procedure. I do not need to see this," he thought with disgust as he quickly backed away, not wanting to witness anymore before they started humping or something. Been there, seen that. He'd wished for the ability to scrub his eyes raw afterwards. There was something about human mating that was incredibly unappealing. It was all sweaty and grunting and squealing like pigs. And most of them had hair in unattractive places, which he would have been quite content to never find out about. Dragon mating was much better. More like a dance in the air than a roll in the mud on the ground. Toothless was very happy that he had been born a dragon. Going back to the mystery of the evening, he was thinking about returning to the village tomorrow to do some spying. There was still that comment about things happening that had him curious. And he thought it prudent to keep a careful eye on these 2 to make sure they didn't start spreading tales of night furies on the island. Maybe Luna would want to come with me. As Toothless slithered through the dark forest back to where he'd left the Queen's offering, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen if he pressed his mouth to Luna's and snuck his tongue into her mouth. He snorted as the instant answer of, "Bite it off," came to mind, distracting him enough that he accidentally stepped on a dry twig, snapping it with a cracking sound that echoed in the silent forest. Oops. Toothless winced and forced himself to concentrate on where he was going, his excellent vision making seeing in the dark a non-problem. But there was still that little niggle of curiosity at the back of his mind to try and press his mouth to Luna's. Just because. By Thor, I love her so much. He was so lost in her taste. Her scent. The silky depths of her hair where his hand was buried at the nape of her neck. The way her soft curves pressed against him as her arms clutched him around the neck and shoulders. Hiccup moaned in surrender as Astrid's delicate little tongue dominated his. He was happy to let her. Astrid echoed his moan with a hum of delight, fingers carding through his messy hair mindlessly. She never thought that she'd grow to love kissing so much in such a very short time. But she did. And she was already looking forward to every stolen kiss that she could get away with until they figured out how to talk their fathers back into something resembling sensible. Yes, her fiancé was a bit scrawny for a Viking, but she honestly didn't care. She'd rather have a smart, caring, sweet, gentlemanly boy who knew the meaning of a bath, cause Hiccup smelled amazing, like soap, hot metal, and a hint of male musk, than an oafish large male who only ever thought of themselves, forced females around, picked their noses, and smelled like dead fish. I could hug and kiss Hiccup forever and be happy to do it. And she vowed to thank Thor every single day for Hiccup, for she loved him beyond all measure. Snap. Astrid and Hiccup jumped apart like guilty teenagers, which they more or less were, at the sound of the crack of a breaking branch. They stared at each other wide-eyed for a moment. What was that? He whispered. Astrid just shook her head. And then his warrior goddess sprang into action, tugging her axe out of a nearby tree, scanning the depths of the forest with wary eyes as she sidled over to the desecrated bush and towed her sword up into the air. She then tossed it at Hiccup in an easy throw. He was ecstatic when he caught it by the hilt for once without fumbling. Of course, she didn't see, still tense and ready for something or someone to spring out at them. Figures. I finally do something half-decently cool and she's looking elsewhere. Hiccup came to stand at her back, taking up a defensive position. He scanned the dark shadows as well, ears straining for another warning sound. A full 5 minutes passed before they relaxed, the returning twitters and chirps of the evening insects singing an indication that all was well. Astrid huffed out a sigh. I guess it was nothing. But I should be getting back anyway before my parents start to worry. She walked back to their makeshift bed and put her armor and belts back on, sheathing her axe across her back. Hiccup followed her around like a faithful puppy. She left him the sword belt and the sword. You keep that one, just in case. Are you sure you're going to be all right out here? She asked as she walked to the other side of the clearing and extricated her throwing daggers from the bark of the tree they were embedded in, sheathing them in the bandolier-type leather strap that held them. I'm sure. Hiccup was quick to reassure. I'm not afraid to be alone. I have something to prove to my father and I refuse to go right back home on the first night. Astrid gave him a quick smile of approval as she started searching the grass for the dagger that she'd dropped when Hiccup had shown up. I wouldn't go right back home either if I was you. But you should at least come into town in the morning for breakfast and to watch me rip a few pieces off of Vilof's thick hide. Preferably with a very dull knife. Hiccup chuckled as he spotted the gleam of steel and picked up Astrid's dagger for her, handing it to her. I wouldn't miss it for anything. I have to work in the morning anyway. And I need more supplies to set up a proper camp out here. While I'm working, I'll eagerly wait for the yelling and cries of pain to start and then come running. Astrid laughed, kissing him on the cheek. You know me so well. Hiccup blushed again. Yeah was all he could say. She touched his warm cheek briefly, smiling at him with moonlight reflecting in her eyes. Have a good sleep, Hiccup. I'll look for you tomorrow, even if I can't say hi. Hiccup touched her cheek in return, stroking his thumb over her cheekbone, still marveling at how soft her skin was. I wish you a good sleep as well, my goddess. Dream of me. Astrid flushed with pleasure at his touch and words. Always. And on that cryptic remark, she pulled away and disappeared into the forest, heading back towards the village of Berk. Hiccup stared at the spot he'd last seen her for a long time. What did she mean by always? Did she mean that she'd been dreaming of him already? Or did she mean that she'd dream of him from now on? Either way, he supposed, it's more than I ever hoped to hear from her. Sighing pathetically in a lovesick fashion, he moved to his blanket and pillow and settled down to sleep for the night, her sword at his side and the moon and insects to keep him company. And his very clever mind started plotting ways to capture or kill himself, that Night Fury, as a way to prove to the moronic adult males in his life that he was worthy of being a future husband to Astrid and a chief for their tribe. And if that didn't work, there was always his original plan that he'd come up with earlier. Oh. Or maybe I could combine the two. They'd respect me for sure if I found the dragon's nest by using a captured Night Fury as a guide. A little over 2 hours later, Toothless returned to their hidden sanctuary after taking his turn placating the queen for another day. After making a data or two, with a childish sticking out of his tongue, he flew right past the tiny island watchtower that contained a snoozing Viking. And then, unable to resist, he circled back and flew even closer and sent a very controlled burst of tiny blue flames at the corpulent male, setting his leather foot covering on fire. Toothless snickered to himself because he knew the now hopping and cursing human would assume he'd let his foot get too close to the fire while he dozed. Stars, I love playing with the humans. Don't get him wrong, he loved Luna beyond all measure, but their life would be a little too monotonous if he didn't have some extracurricular activities to keep things interesting. I can't wait until we've progressed to the point where we can use mating as a way to pass the time. Frequently. Very frequently. Luna, who had some unknown date in her mind for when they were old enough to engage in mating acts, liked to pretend she was above such immature actions against the humans. But he knew for a fact that she lived to torment the fishing boats by going invisible and causing absolute chaos on their ships by moving things just enough to make the humans fumble, or by releasing their nets and letting all the fish go and then laughing her head off as the humans blamed each other for bad knots or incompetent hands. Toothless flew around to the watchtower on the other side of the island, hoping to catch a second human asleep on the job. No such luck, this time. This human was wide awake, on her feet, and staring out over the ocean with keen eyes. Figures. He'd yet to catch a female human asleep on the job. Just like a dragoness, they were clearly more responsible than their male counterparts, which is why nature had made the females the mothers of young. If males were in charge of the dragon eggs, half of them probably wouldn't survive. As he quickly dove out of the Viking's line of sight, he thought, it's a good thing I'm basically invisible against the black night sky. Unless there's a silhouetting moon involved, apparently. Must remember that one. Flying away on silent wings, he rounded the back of the island and came to a gentle landing on the cliff nearest their home that overlooked the ocean in one direction and their little piece of paradise in the other. You were gone longer than normal, Luna said as he settled onto his haunches right beside her. She leaned into his side as he joined her in her perusal of the moon and the constellations, accompanied by the steady sound of crashing waves on the rocks below them. Toothless gave his gorgeous girlfriend, whose iridescent scales outshone the moon in beauty, a sideways glance, wondering how she was going to take the news he was about to impart. And like all males, he tried to downplay the scenario as much as possible in a faint hope of saving himself from the anticipated wrath of his mate. I had a small issue with a noisy sheep and a couple of young humans who were in the woods near the sheep pasture. It didn't take long for Luna's keen mind to connect the dots to what he didn't say. She turned her head and gave him an incredulous stare. You were seen by humans? Toothless studied his toes like he'd never seen them before. Maybe. There is no maybe. Either you were or you weren't. As much as one could mentally mutter, yes, that's what the ashamed dragon did. Toothless. It was the blasted woolly menace's fault. It wouldn't shut up. I had to kill it. Toothless. Her tone was resigned this time. What did you do? I turned around when I heard them say Night Fury, dropped the sheep on the ground, and then snuck up to their clearing and eavesdropped. He paused there, not really sure how to justify his reasoning on letting the humans live. But, honestly, he wasn't a murderer and wasn't sure if he ever could be. Killing a sheep who was destined to be dinner anyway was bad enough. Killing intelligent, if bothersome, humans just seemed a little too much like killing one of his own kind. And, as far as he knew, Luna felt the same. But, so far, neither of them, despite living on a human-settled island, had encountered any problems with them. Until now. It helped that both had the ability to go invisible if necessary. Luna was especially good at it. And despite playing with the humans a bit, they hadn't actually done anything that had given away their presence on the far side of the island. And Luna was dying of curiosity now. And he was taking his sweet time continuing his story. What did you hear? Did you kill them? Leave them? What? They talked about whether or not they should tell their village about seeing me and decided not to, mostly because they thought they wouldn't be believed. So you're going to trust them to stay quiet? You know it could cause major problems if the humans started hunting us. I know. That's why I'm going to be keeping an eye on these two humans. You are? He nodded. You can help me if you want. We can call it an adventure or something. And who knows? It could be fun. And maybe we'll learn more about the humans. If you say so. I do. I already learned something new tonight. You did? He nodded again, repeatedly and quickly, glowing green eyes glittering with excitement and mischief, which made Luna look at him suspiciously. I learned that mutual mouth pressing means more than just shut up. It seems to be some sort of mating thing. The two young humans did it, and they seemed to be enjoying it very much based on their pleasure sounds and how their body temperatures rose. I'm pretty sure they were using their tongues too. Really? Luna said disbelievingly. I can't see how that can be pleasurable at all. It sounds rather gross, actually. Toothless slumped a little at that, making Luna roll her eyes. Don't tell me. You wanted us to try it, didn't you? Well, yeah, he admitted. I know our mouths aren't really shaped right for full-on mouth pressing, but I thought it could be interesting to try just for the sake of curiosity. He looked so dejected at the thought of not doing the experiment that Luna almost immediately caved in. He'd mope about it for days if she didn't. And really, it couldn't be that terrible to lick his tongue with hers. They licked each other's faces all the time in demonstrations of affection. This was sort of like that. Just slimier. Fine. We can try it. Toothless immediately lit up, of course. We can. Yes. Really, really. Yes. Really, really, really. Not if you're going to be an idiot about it. Sorry. Luna rolled her eyes at her cute but clueless almost mate for what had to be the 1000th time in a year. Just do it. Okay. They stared at each other for a couple of awkward moments, neither really knowing how to start something they had no clue how to do. But then Toothless took a deep breath and puffed out his chest, filling himself with false confidence. Then he licked her cheek sweetly. Thank you for indulging me, my beautiful moonbeam. As he thought, he moved around a bit so he was more in front of her, giving her muzzle little licks along the way. At the last word, he pushed the front of his rather wide mouth to hers dead on and then just sort of left it there. Luna had thought the licks were very nice, and she'd closed her eyes in pleasure. Then his mouth pressed to the front of hers and she opened her eyes to look at his. This is weird. And not particularly comfortable. Agreed. Maybe it's better with tongue licking. Luna obligingly opened her mouth, retracted her teeth, and prepared to be disgusted. And then Toothless ran his tongue along hers and she found she really wasn't. He did it again and her eyes closed as a tiny moan of pleasure escaped her. She reciprocated the move, stroking his tongue with hers and he moaned too. Their mouths opened wider and soon they were fighting to see who got to lick who in a tumble of writhing, ultra-sensitive tongues. In no time at all, Toothless was making a rumbling purr sound deep in his chest that she copied in a gentler fashion as their tongues danced together. By mutual agreement, their wings started to flap, catching the air, still kissing as the dragons rose into the sky. One was black as night, the other was white as light itself. They flew straight up with powerful flaps of their wings, front legs entwined. Once they'd reached a height that exceeded the reach of the moonlight, high up in the atmosphere, they pulled apart, hovering in place and looking at each other in wonder. By the light of the enchanted moon, Toothless has found yet another way for me to fall even deeper in love with him. As if his fun, artistic, sweet, and caring nature wasn't enough. Luna licked his cheek and ears affectionately. That was amazing. Toothless grinned at her, mouth hanging open slightly. So, you wouldn't mind doing it again? She flew around him in a circle, making his head spin on his neck to keep her in sight, fluttering her eyelids at him in a flirtatious fashion. I suppose we can add tongue licking to our daily routine. And perhaps watching your humans isn't such a bad idea, if they have other interesting things for us to try. Toothless beamed at his dragoness. Awesome. Can I tongue lick you again now? Luna laughed enticingly. Perhaps. If you can catch me. And then she flew off like a bolt of lightning. He chortled in delight and shot after his feisty dragoness, heart thrumming in anticipation of the hunt. By the great dragon, I love her. Suuuuu much. Chapter 12, The Morning After, Part 1. Chapter Text. The Morning After, Part 1. Stoic spent a long night doing his best to get mindlessly drunk on mead, since that was all he had in the house, and he couldn't bear to wander back into the village to find something stronger and possibly meet someone who might look at him accusingly of being a terrible father and chief. Unfortunately, mead was never going to be strong enough to take down a man of his size, no matter how many buckets worth he consumed. So, instead of dulling his memory of his losses and failings, Stoic was cursed with having to make an extra trip or two to the outhouse and a guilty conscience that weighed like a full-grown yak on his shoulders. Maybe even 2 full-grown yaks, one for each side. He couldn't stop thinking about his fight with Hiccup. Couldn't stop thinking about his fight with Hector. How their words had finally opened his eyes to the truth of Hiccup's mediocre status in the tribe. Nor could he stop thinking about his Loki cursed words about Astrid. That poor girl had not deserved that from me by even the tiniest degree. He was also beset by worry over where Hiccup had gone and if he was all right. What if he got lost? What if he was carried off by a dragon? What if he ran away and never came home? These same thoughts repeated too many times to count. And to top off his misery, Stoic missed Valka more than his own life. He'd dragged the cask of mead and his solid wood chair into the doorway of his bedroom and stared at her painting for hours that night by the flickering light and shadows of the fire, mug in hand, and what felt like a never-ending stream of slow tears trickling into his beard as he begged the gods to please bring her back to him and help him fix the mess he'd made of his son's life. Because he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to make everything better again. And he couldn't make his tormented mind come up with anything helpful, either. Eventually, he fell asleep in his chair, empty mug falling out of nerveless fingers, and heart aching in his chest. When he woke up, the sun was already a couple hours past rising and shining directly into his face through the window in his room. Squinting and grumbling, Stoic forced his stiff body from the chair and made for the outside world. Because, personal hell or not, he was still the chief and he had a job to do to keep his people safe, fed, and happy. Hiccup had spent a large portion of the night plotting before finally falling into an exhausted slumber. Despite this, he woke up with the first call of the woodland birds before the turning of the planet had done little more than ease the sky into a lighter shade of dark. The tops of the trees were black against the deep blue sky as he climbed a tree and hooked his bag, blanket, and pillow into a notch between branch and trunk to help preserve them from critters and possible inclement weather. I really need to get myself a tent. And some tools. Tools would definitely be helpful if I'm going to make a semi-permanent camp out here. With Astrid's sword strapped to his waist, he jogged back to the village, which took him about half an hour, enough time for the first ray of the sun to crest the horizon. He was just early enough to sneak through town without meeting anyone. He reached the smithy before Gobber, which was normal, ignoring the grumbling of his stomach that was demanding breakfast, and set to work starting the forge. 5 minutes later, he had a small piece of silver rod melting to make a new pin for the back of Astrid's silver skull ornament. While that heated, he unstrapped her sword, unsheathed it from the plain scabbard, and set to work sharpening it for her, not knowing if she'd need it for her confrontation with Ilof, but figured it was best to be prepared anyhow. It didn't take him long to weld the new pin onto the back of the little skull with more melted silver, which was good because he was nearly hopping with eagerness to see Astrid again. He gave the metal a minute to cool naturally before dunking it in room temperature water to speed up the process, the weld too delicate to risk dunking it sooner. And then he was out the door and power walking towards Astrid's house with her sword cradled under an arm and her skull held carefully in his hand. He wasn't sure how he was going to get Astrid her things without getting in trouble if her father was still home, but he figured he'd come up with something on the fly if he had to. It was too important to him that Astrid be fully armed if she needed to be than for him to play things safe. More people were up and about now, and they either ignored him, called good morning, or sneered at him but refrained from outright name-calling for once, not wanting to inspire Stoic's wrath if found out. Hector's beating and how Stoic had walked away from the fight virtually unscathed was still fresh in their minds. Every once in a while, it's actually a good thing to have a 400-pound battering ram of a Viking for a father. I wish it was more than once in a while. I wish I was bigger so that he could have been proud of me from the start and didn't have to hide me from the world. With that truly depressing thought, Hiccup arrived at the Horfusons' house just as they were walking out the door. He was immediately subjected to Hector's suspicious glare from within his bruised and swollen face, making Hiccup wince in sympathy as he pictured his father's massive fists pounding into Hector. Fortunately for Hiccup, who'd been scrambling for a good reason to be where he was, Astrid jumped down the step, exclaiming, "Oh, thank you, Hiccup, you already sharpened the sword I left at the smithy last night," forestalling her glowering father from coming to any more damning conclusions than he already had. Hiccup nodded quickly and handed her sword, impressed with her quick thinking. He had to work really hard to not let himself beam at her stupidly and keep his expression and tone neutral. "I did. I saw it when I walked in this morning." Then he held out his hand and waited for her to hold hers palm up. "And I fixed this for you, too." As he dropped the little ornament into her hand, he managed to just brush her palm with the tips of his fingers. Astrid's breath caught at the touch and it was all she could do not to throw her arms around him in her thanks for his speedy fix of her skull. But she could feel her father's eyes on them and the silent warning on the air to wrap this up before he did something she'd not like very much. It was hard, though, her heart was still jumping in excitement from seeing Hiccup walking up the path as she opened the door. She caught his eyes as she closed her fingers around the skull, seeing the barely masked longing in the beautiful green depths. "Thank you." Hiccup's heart was pounding in his chest, the tips of his fingers were tingling, he was possibly trembling like a leaf, and all he wanted to do was kiss her good morning. But he hid it, somehow, and simply said, "You're welcome. It was nothing. Just doing my job." Then he nodded respectfully at her parents, pretending that they hadn't practically raised him. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. H." "Morning, Hiccup," they replied in near unison. Alga looked at him sympathetically, her voice soft. Hector still glowered, and he all but growled his response. It wasn't hard to figure out where he stood with each of them. Somehow, the boy made his jelly-like legs turn around and walk in a fair semblance of normal back towards the smithy. Which just happened to be the same way that the Horfusons were going as well. Which meant he was acutely aware of them walking a few houses worth back, since they'd paused for Alga to put Astrid's missing skull back on her leather belt. He could feel their eyes on him in the form of the fine hairs on the back of his neck standing up in alert. He could hear the soft murmur of their voices as Astrid tried to tell them for what was probably the dozenth time that she'd be fine standing up to Ilof on her own and that they didn't need to hover over her. They were going to hover anyway. And that's exactly what Hiccup intended to do as well, as unobtrusively as possible, of course. When Gobber hobbled into his shop an hour after dawn, rubbing his neck, still wondering how it was possible to feel like he'd slept wrong, when he was pretty sure he hadn't actually slept at all over his worry about the current messed up situation, Hiccup was already there and was working on the backlog of weapons that needed sharpening and fixing from the last dragon attack a few days ago. "Morning," Gobber, Hiccup said cheerily. Gobber eyed his apprentice blearily, wondering if he'd dreamed up the events of last night, despite never actually going to sleep. "You're in a surprisingly good mood this morning." Hiccup blinked just once as he realized that he probably shouldn't be this happy considering no else could know that he and Astrid had spent an absolutely idyllic time snogging in the forest last night, night fury interruption notwithstanding. He quickly came up with a viable reason for his good cheer. He shrugged and gave Gobber a lopsided grin as he sharpened a sword on the grinding wheel. "It's not every day I have a roaring fight with my dad and move out of the house." The elder Viking suddenly found himself wide awake and his neck woes were forgotten. "You didn't." "I did. I slept in the forest last night and felt like a sort of strong, independent, almost Viking for the first time in my life." He smirked, no heat to his otherwise bitter words. Gobber's face split into a wide grin and he clapped Hiccup on the back with his real hand. "Good for you." Hiccup tried not to stagger, but he hadn't braced himself fast enough. He recovered by turning it into a purposeful step towards the bench that held the finished items and picked up a couple more weapons that were ready for delivery. With his arms now full, he aimed for the front of the shop, Gobber following him. As he walked, Hiccup said over his shoulder, and the best part, Gobber. What's that? Dad finally admitted that I should be training like the other kids. Gobber was left with his jaw hanging near the vicinity of the floor as Hiccup practically bounced out of the smithy to deliver the finished weapons, because he'd never thought the day would come that his best friend, his chief with a stubborn streak wider than the ocean, would admit to being wrong. The morning sky was bright and clear as Astrid looked up at it, wishing for some clouds to show up so she could imagine them as Valkyries coming down from Valhalla to enact judgment on Ilof. But it wasn't to be, so she shifted her weight a bit in her lean against a support beam of the trading post's large deck, and returned to glaring at Ilof's house, which just happened to be across the path from her current location. She'd been standing here for 2 hours while she waited for the lying coward to emerge and face her. All around her, the village of Berk bustled as people went about their daily lives, shopping, cutting firewood for the winter, making repairs to houses that had been scorched in the latest dragon raid, chasing after their children and pet livestock, and so on. On the surface, everything seemed normal, with them calling good morning to her just like they always would have, but Astrid could sense the curious and sometimes judgmental glances they gave her when she wasn't looking at them directly. The tedious wait had been broken up by Hiccup, who'd managed to pass by her on 4 different occasions, ostensibly on deliveries or supply runs for Gobber. They managed to pretend that the other didn't exist well enough to satisfy her father, who'd parked himself in a chair on the deck of the trading post, but Astrid saw the secret gleam in his gorgeous emerald eyes as he passed her with the barest hint of a sideways glance. Those looks warmed her to the core and kept her resolute in her determination to annihilate the rumors no doubt flying around the village about her. Her father, of course, was keeping an eye on her and making sure no idiotic boys tried anything funny. Not even Snotlout bothered to hang around once he was subjected to her father's glare, eyes nearly swollen shut or not. Rough and Tough had kept her company for a while, chatting her ears off about absolutely nothing important, like usual. But they ended with a little bit of entertainment that actually caught her admittedly distracted attention, something about an officiating apprenticeship they tried for a whole day before the village officiator threw himself off a cliff to get away from the loquacious twins. They thought it was hilarious, of course. It was a shame, actually, because if anyone would be good at droning on about important things that no one wanted to hear about, Tough was it. The one thing they didn't mention was anything to do with last night's rather epic fight. Either they miraculously hadn't heard the new rumors circling the village about her apparent promiscuity, or they'd somehow learned some tact. Astrid was betting on the former. Tough Nut was exempt from her father's glare, being a year younger than Astrid, and not yet showing signs of noticing that girls were desirable things. But then, with his less than fastidious twin sister as an example, he was not likely to come to that conclusion anytime soon. Probably a good thing for female kind, considering he wasn't all that keen on bathing either. Astrid generally liked the twins in an eye-rolling, Thor save her, kind of way, but she was happy to see them wander off, apparently to try and talk Fishlegs and Snotlout into joining them on some prank or other. She wished them luck. As long as it isn't against me. Or Hiccup. They had a terrible habit of focusing on poor Hiccup for their jokes no matter how many times she'd warned them against it. The twins enjoyed the challenge of trying and failing to avoid her revenge, mental deviants that they were. At least they're not boring. Which is what I am, bored out of my mind, that is. Loitering around and accomplishing nothing useful was very much against her nature, and she was itching to do something. Anything. But she daren't leave her post, or Ilof the not-so-lucky might sneak away and she didn't feel like tracking him down for their confrontation. For one thing, she rather liked this location, being practically in the center of the village and sure to attract a sizable crowd once things became interesting. Astrid wanted the question of her good reputation cleared sooner than later, because she couldn't stand the thought of people thinking less of her. Sighing in a rather dramatic way, eliciting a chuckle from her father sitting above her, Astrid pulled the tiny dagger out of her arm wrapping and started trimming her nails. She almost gave in to the urge to make them into sharp claws so she could scratch Ilof's eyes out, but refrained because that really wasn't her style. Both fighting and cosmetic. Instead, she trimmed the rough edges off into the neat half circles she kept her nails at, mentally grumbling that she had to resort to personal grooming to pass the time while waiting for her nemesis to get his lazy ass out of bed. Olaf returned from his overnight shift on the watchtower disgruntled and grumbling. He never should have taken that extra flask of whiskey with him, but his son's less than stellar behavior had seemed like it was worthy of an extra drink or two. Somehow, he'd fallen asleep and managed to set his boot on fire. Aside from jumping off the tower and going for a swim, the only thing he could come up with while in a panic to put the fire out has him now smelling like his own piss. And then he'd been caught asleep yet again when Bucket had to prod him awake to take his turn on watch. Olaf was already not having a good day. And to make it just that little bit worse, his head was pounding. He needed to empty his bladder in a more conventional fashion, and a tiny blonde-haired girl was parked across the path from his house, looking like a very pissed-off young Valkyrie as she tossed a miniature dagger into the air over and over again. And Hector was sharpening his axe on the trading post's deck. And Alga was conveniently nearby as well, talking with a small pack of females like they had nothing better to do than eyeball his house and look murderous. He couldn't help but notice that they were all mothers of teenage girls. Shit. My stupid son is in big trouble. And he bloody well deserves it. Not for the first time, Olaf wished his wife hadn't died birthing his idiot son. And maybe he should have looked for a new wife to replace her, but like his chief, he believed his mate to be irreplaceable. But he'd obviously messed up somewhere in the raising of Ilof all on his own. I'll get him, he snarled to Astrid as he stomped past. Thank you, she said sweetly to his back. Olaf crashed into his house with a bang, slamming the door back against the wall. He promptly winced as his head protested the noise, but it didn't stop his feet from continuing their trek up the stairs to Ilof's room. That door was crashed open as well, headache be damned. Ilof was snoring away on his wooden bed platform, hugging his pillow, dressed in only his trousers, and completely oblivious to the drama awaiting him outside. Growling under his breath about Thor-forsaken teenage sons, Olaf grabbed a foot and a wrist and dragged his son right off his bed, dumping him on the floor with a hard thud. Ilof woke up sputtering before he got his bearings and glared up at his father as he scrambled to his feet. What the fuck was that for? Olaf crossed his arms and glared down at his son that he was thankfully still taller than. Just. That was for lying about Astrid last night. Ilof crossed his arms over his bare chest and curled his lip belligerently. Who says I was lying? The little whore. Olaf let his temper loose with a backhand to that sneering face that so favored his wife's Thor-blessed family. That's enough, he roared at his son who was now sprawled on his bed from where he'd fallen. He sucked in a deep breath to cool his temper a fraction before he whipped off his belt and walloped his almost grown son like he was still a naughty child. You will cease defaming Astrid right now or I will personally kill you, do you understand? Ilof pushed himself back to his feet, the right side of his face burning like fire. But she stabbed my dick. It was bleeding and everything. Olaf blinked a couple times as he processed that somewhat shocking bit of information. And then his brain kicked back into gear. And what did you do to deserve that? Ilof couldn't meet his father's angry, disappointed brown eyes any longer. He shrunk into himself a bit and stubbed his toe into the floorboard. I forced a kiss on her that she didn't want. Olaf rolled his eyes and snorted in derision. Then you deserved it. And you deserve whatever else she does to you. What do you mean? I mean she's waiting for you. And her parents. And half the village, it looks like. So get dressed and get out there and apologize for lying or you're not my son anymore and you can get your horny ass off this island and find a new tribe. Ilof gulped at how dead serious his father sounded. Holy Thor, I think he actually means it. The words that emerged sounded like a pathetic squeak. Yes, Dad. Olaf nodded once. Good. Now go fix the mess you made. He turned on his heel and stomped down the stairs and then out the back door to the outhouse to take care of one more grievance. He felt bad about striking his son, but he honestly didn't know what else to do. Get through to him sometimes. He loved his boy, he really did, and he was usually very proud of his accomplishments, but lately Ilof had been acting more and more self-entitled and like the usually unspoken rules of honorable behavior didn't apply to him anymore. Maybe this incident with Astrid will finally be what is needed to open Ilof's eyes to reality. If I'm really lucky. Hiccup had just passed Astrid for the 5th time that morning, carrying another armload of swords and axes, when Ilof finally showed his highly overrated handsome face to the light of day. It's about time, Astrid muttered to herself in a less than quiet tone, straightening up from her lean and crossing her arms over her chest. Hector snorted to himself in agreement from above. His axe had never been sharper in its life and his ass was going numb from sitting on the wooden bench for so long. Ilof took a second to glance up and down the path, noting the unusually high number of people lingering in the area before he turned his focus on Astrid and sneered, curling his lip up in disdain. He stepped off the flat stone that graced the landing of his doorway and started walking across the 20 or 30 feet that separated them. Astrid immediately moved to meet him halfway. "Careful, Ilof, or your face might get stuck that way," she taunted. Then she smiled at him in a most unpleasant fashion. "Then again, keep the sneer, it's a more accurate representation of who you truly are." Ilof stopped a few feet from the girl who was roughly half his size, hands curling into fists at his sides. "Did you just insult me, you little bitch?" Astrid had her axe in her hands in an instant, trying to decide if anyone would blame her if she beheaded him or if maybe chopping him off at the knees might be a more fitting punishment. From his hiding spot just out of Hector's line of sight to the side of the trading post, Hiccup growled under his breath, hands closing convulsively around the hilt of a sword and dropping the rest of the weapons thoughtlessly. Hector shot up to his feet and growled much louder in a warning fashion, drawing Ilof's gaze for a half a second before he was dismissed as unimportant. Hector was not impressed and was seriously considering pounding the lying, dunderheaded teenager into the ground until there was nothing left but a moaning mass of pulp left. Astrid can beat up whatever remains of the little shit after that. A little ways down the path, Alga was thinking nearly the exact same thing. "Ilof." His father's voice cut across the space from the doorway behind him. "What did I just tell you?" Olaf all but thundered. Every single person in hearing range froze whatever they were doing or pretending to do and rushed to the area to see the drama, including one grumpy chief of Berk. Ilof glanced over his shoulder and sneered at his father too. "Why should I apologize to her? She doesn't deserve it." Astrid glared up at the world's stupidest boy. "If I'm a bitch, then you're an asshole, Ilof, the lucky to still be alive right now." Ilof scoffed. "Oh, really? And who here is going to do me in then?" "You. Your pathetic, beat-up father. Your mommy. Your afterthought of a boyfriend who isn't much bigger than the sword he's holding." He flicked his eyes to where Hiccup had unconsciously moved to the front of the trading post where he was now quite visible after squeezing his way to the front of the crowd. "None of you could take me in a fight even if I had one hand tied behind my back and my feet were tied together." Stoic forced his way through the gathering crowd, using his bulk to his advantage. "I'm very tempted to make you prove that boast, Ilof Olafsson," he called out in a warning tone, all but stomping up to the teenagers. "Against me." He came to a stop pretty much in Ilof's personal space and crossed his arms over his massive chest and glowered down at the boy who, while tall, was still about 5 inches short of Stoic's 6'9" frame and a couple 100 pounds of muscle lighter. Ilof gulped, suddenly realizing he might have blundered. "I didn't." "Shut it!" Stoic bellowed. Ilof snapped his mouth closed and looked sick as Olaf moved to join their little group. Astrid twirled her axe in her hands, smirking a little as the boy was put down. This might not be the beating she wanted to give him, but humiliation was working for her as a pretty close second. Stoic turned his piercing green gaze on Olaf. "Your boy is aggravating me, Olaf. Is there a purpose to this mess that I've missed that would explain things?" Olaf nodded quickly, glaring at his son. "Ilof is supposed to be apologizing to Astrid for telling untruths about her last night, but he's already forgotten what I told him about disowning him not even 15 minutes ago." "I see." Stoic raised a bushy red brow at Ilof. "If you have any sense in your pea-sized brain, you will apologize to Astrid." The fearless leader of Berk closed his eyes for a second and appeared to deflate ever so slightly before adding, "Right after I do." The vast majority of the hairy hooligan tribe, who had gravitated to the proceedings like vultures to the dying, gaped at this unprecedented event. Stoic the Vast had never publicly apologized to anyone for his actions before yesterday, and now he was on his second apology in less than a day. The world must be coming to an end. Stoic faced the tiny little warrior girl, who, despite being tall enough for a girl, though still a good foot shorter than Stoic, was still very lean for a Vikingess, and winced at the look of hurt and disappointment on her face as she looked up at him. He rubbed the back of his neck as if that would help with the apologizing. "Astrid." Add in a heaved sigh for effect. And then another, Astrid, that went nowhere. She raised the brow knot covered by her side-swept bangs at his procrastinating. Who knew apologizing to a girl would be so hard? Then again, I certainly did my share of apologizing to Valka, so this can't possibly be that different. Right. Stoic tried again. Astrid. I am deeply sorry that I said some things that I know were not true which lead to the Yakid here to slur your name further. I'm also sorry that I kicked you out of my house last night. You know you're always welcome at my hearth. Astrid only needed a few seconds to forgive the man. He was a male after all, and their stupidity as a whole was a well-known fact that womankind had learned to live with eons ago. And he'd always been nice to her during all of their previous interactions. And he'd looked like he was about to walk into a pool of lava without any boots on while he said it, so she didn't want to make the poor man suffer any longer. She smiled widely at the Gronkel-sized man with the rather epic beard. Apology accepted, Chief Stoic. You can rest easier now knowing that I won't let either of my parents murder you in your sleep. Thanks. Stoic thought she might be teasing about that last bit until he glanced at said parents and received matching glares. Apparently they are still not entirely pleased with me. Oh well. Stoic shrugged it off, knowing his friends would forgive him eventually. He turned his focus back to Ilof and scowled at him when he found the boy glaring obstinately at an axe-twirling Astrid, their gazes locked on each other in a silent glare-off. He smacked the boy upside the back of his head, eliciting a hey of protest. Rescind your statement from last night, Ilof, or you're out of this tribe and sailing away in a leaky dinghy with no supplies, Stoic growled. Olaf grimaced at the warning, knowing it was no empty threat. His son was an idiot, but he didn't want to lose him. Ilof grimaced in a nearly identical expression, but he wasn't as stupid as everyone was thinking right now. He swallowed his pride, plastered on an expression that vaguely resembled sincerity, and said, I'm sorry I lied about you yesterday, Astrid. Although I doubt anyone believed me anyhow, you're entirely too frigid to let any of us so much as snatch a proper kiss, not to mention get anywhere near your knickers. The crowd gave a chorused gasp while more than a few, Astrid, her parents, Hiccup, Stoic, Gothai, and several more women, glared with insulted indignation. Ilof, his father scolded with a wince, smacking the Moran upside the head again. Seriously, son, we have to work on your tact. What? Ilof asked. I'm just speaking the truth. Stoic growled under his breath. Is that a satisfactory apology for you, Astrid? Or would you like more? His tone clearly said he'd fully support her if she wanted more. Astrid did. She smiled maliciously. Oh, I think more is needed. I want to see him fight the way he boasted he could. Her axe twirled in her hands again threateningly as Stoic said, done, and Ilof paled to the color of new snow. And just to make things perfectly clear, Astrid added with every syllable emphasized through gritted teeth. Hiccup is not an afterthought, nor is he my boyfriend. Oh, Hiccup muttered, sensing where this was going. Astrid was in a right rage and she was going to say something that she, or he, was going to end up regretting later. Hiccup is my best friend. And my fiancé. And he doesn't think I'm frigid at all. Another shocked gasp from the crowd, except for a few exceptions, as Alga gave a knowing smirk. Stoic wasn't far behind, shooting his son a wink. Hiccup didn't see it though, because he had his palm over his bright red face. Up on a hill overlooking the village, hidden amongst the trees, two dragons looked on with their keen sight and hearing. What's a fiancé? The black one asked the white one. The white one shrugged. Not a clue. Maybe another word for mate, considering you said those two acted like mates last night. Sounds like a reasonable guess to me. Toothless gave his own promised mate a panting smile for being so smart. She rolled her eyes at him playfully and nudged him hard enough with her shoulder to almost knock him off the thick branch they were perched on. His green eyes heated and she gasped in mock alarm, dodging just in time as he leapt at where she'd been perched. Giggling, they scampered through the treetops in a game of chase that ended with Toothless pinning her down and licking all over her face repeatedly until she finally opened her mouth and licked him back. Chapter 13, The Morning After, Part 2. Chapter Text. The Morning After, Part 2. He's what? Astrid closed her eyes for a second as she realized what she'd done. But her shoulders and jaw set in determination within moments and she spun around and pointed her axe at her father. Don't you start on me. Hiccup asked me before you said I could never see him again and I said yes. He's my intended whether you like it or not. And I still forbid it. Hector snarled, stomping off the trading post deck, and shoving his way through the crowd. He snatched Hiccup up by the back of his tunic on the way by and stomped into the circle of confrontation. Hiccup grunted as he was dropped in front of Astrid and Stoic. This Hector waved his hand over the approximate entirety of Hiccup, is not marriage material. How can you not see that? Ilof tried to take the opportunity to slip away while the important players were distracted, but his father caught him by the tunic and forced him to stay with a glare that clearly said, "You're going to take your punishment like a man, or else." Astrid pushed the head of her axe into her father's chest. "And how can you not see past the obvious?" she all but screeched. "Hiccup is so much more than an average idiotic Viking boy. He's smart and respectful and talented at his craft." She glanced at the almost new, beautifully made axe in her hand as an example. "Would you rather I marry Ilof, the epitome of what all Vikings should be? Strong, tough, fearless, virile." Hector grimaced and shook his head. "Or Snotlout? A little short perhaps, but still falling under the above definitions." "Certainly not. He's a Jorgensen," Hector spit out. Astrid smirked at Snotlout's and Spitaloot's matching sputters of, "What's wrong with a Jorgensen?" "I rest my case," Astrid said smugly. "There are other boys on the island," Hector grumbled. "And for that matter, I can take you off this island to meet a whole new crop of boys and you can forget Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III. Astrid crossed her arms over her chest, axe resting across one, glaring down her much taller father. "Not going to happen. I'll run away and sail back all by myself if you drag me away. And you'd have to knock me out to get my feet off Burke." Hector's head fell, many-braided platinum hair falling forward, as he pinched the bridge of his nose. "Thank Thor I only have one daughter to deal with. I can't imagine trying to barter with a whole parcel of them and their teenage female dramatics." While the Horfusons bickered, Stoic studied the people around him, seeing the boy who deserved a beating and the boy who easily held a sword in his hand with a fierce grip that turned his knuckles white, his feet unconsciously braced as if prepared to fight to defend his girl as he looked between father and daughter with concern etched all over his face. Stoic stroked his beard thoughtfully. "What are the odds that my wee Hiccup actually knows how to use that sword despite the fact that he's never had any training from an adult? His best friend just happens to be the best and most dedicated young warrior on the island. Is it perhaps safe to assume that she's been training him on the sly just because it was against the rules and she lives to fight?" He glanced over to Alga, who, like all females with their uncanny senses, seemed to know what he was thinking as she nodded once with an approving smile. His eyebrow rose. If anyone knew if Astrid had been training Hiccup, it would be her mother. That woman is Burke's best female warrior and a fiercely protective mother. It is undoubtable that she probably knows exactly what her daughter is up to more often than not. Stoic cleared his throat loudly to interject into the father-forward/daughter battle of words. When they looked at him with matching glares from identical eyes for interrupting, he almost laughed. Instead, he schooled his face to remain serious. "Might I suggest a compromise?" "You might," Hector conceded. "I'm listening," Astrid added. Hiccup stared at his father with a new sense of dread, shaking his head slowly. He automatically didn't like any idea that might take Astrid away from him, even though he hadn't heard it yet. There was an obstruction in his throat that prevented him from saying, "Dad, please don't make this worse," like he wanted to. Stoic smirked at all of the people in his little group. "I suggest that Hiccup fight Ilof to prove he's a worthy Viking for Astrid to marry." "That's not a fair fight. Ilof's twice as big as Hiccup and has years more experience with fighting." Astrid immediately spit out. Stoic hid his relieved grin as he noticed that she didn't say that Hiccup had zero experience with fighting. "You didn't let me finish," Stoic scolded lightly. "But Ilof has to fight with his earlier boasts. His dominant hand will be tied behind his back to his belt, and his feet will be tied together so he has only a foot of leeway. And to make things just a little more interesting, they'll fight on top of the head table in the Great Hall. First one to bleed, lose their weapon, or fall off the table loses." While Ilof sputtered protestations at how unfair that was, Stoic glanced between Astrid and Hiccup for approval. Astrid had a slow grin spreading across her face, further cementing his theory that she'd been training Hiccup whenever she could get away with it. And Hiccup looked. Actually, he wasn't sure how his son looked. There was relief there. Fear. Resignation. But the longer he watched emotions flicker across that little face, the more determination took precedence. Stoic was proud of his son. And what if Hiccup loses? Hector said, deflating Stoic's puffed-up chest a little. Then the engagement is broken and Astrid will agree to keeping an open mind about other boys, but they can still be friends. To tear them apart permanently is just cruel. Stoic said this with his "and that's my final word" on the subject voice that brooked no argument. Fine. Hector conceded. Fine, Astrid echoed, after looking at Hiccup for a moment, their eyes meeting as they silently agreed that staying friends was better than nothing. It still wasn't great, considering how much she liked kissing him, but still, something she could live with. But she was fairly confident that Hiccup could beat Ilof with the handicaps. Hiccup was by far more agile and swift-footed than Ilof and should have no problem staying on the table while dodging Ilof's swings. Stoic turned to the muttering crowd and said in a booming voice so even the furthest could hear, "All right, everyone who wants to watch, to the Great Hall." This prompted a marginally orderly stampede towards the Great Hall perched high on the hill overlooking the village. "Olaf, take your son and prepare him for the battle." The brown-haired man nodded and pushed a very reluctant Ilof away by the scruff of his neck. Stoic held Hiccup back by putting a huge hand on his narrow shoulder. He sent Astrid and her parents ahead, since they had been hanging back as well. He watched with amusement as the girl dragged her feet and looked back at Hiccup every other step, and his son stared right back at her with his heart in his eyes. Once he was sure they were out of earshot, Stoic made Hiccup face him by grabbing his other shoulder as well, feeling a lot of bone, but there was a lean layer of muscle on top of it, indicating at least some sort of strength and, pleased Thor, training. Who would have guessed that I'd be happy that Hiccup disobeyed my orders? Hiccup didn't know what to make of his father right now. Yesterday he was all snarling bear who'd been woken up from hibernation too early, and today he was like a dog crawling on his stomach, trying to make amends. Not that he was complaining, but this was a side of his father that he'd never seen before and was wondering if it came with a catch. "I think it's safe to say she loves you," Stoic started with as a way to break the ice after Hiccup stared up at him with an inscrutable expression for what felt like a solid minute of awkward silence. Hiccup felt his face heating instantly. He darted his eyes down, sure his boots were fascinating. And suddenly they were. One thing was for sure, his boots were maybe half the size of his father's. Will there ever come a day when I'm capable of filling my father's boots, both figuratively and literally? I very much doubt it. I'll never grow as big as Dad. We'll never be half the warrior he is. We'll probably never earn even half the respect he does. We'll probably never be able to lead and command our people the way he does. My future is really depressing. But I do have one thing going for me, and that's Astrid. And that is enough. Glancing up at the mountain of a man waiting patiently for him to respond, Hiccup had another epiphany. Actually, I have two things. I have a suddenly supportive father too. So what if I never fill Dad's boots? Who says I have to? I can be my own person, do my own thing. And if Dad still wants me to take over as chief one day, then I'll deal with that when it happens. Finally responding to his father's teasing, Hiccup nodded, looking up the pathway at a perfect blonde goddess retreating form once again. Yeah. She loves me. Don't know why, but she does. Stoic chuckled, putting a heavy arm across Hiccup's shoulders and starting a stroll up the path. I know why. She loves you for the same reasons that I do, son. She knows just how incredible you are. Hiccup gawked up at his father, the heavy sword in his hand all but dragging on the ground now as he carried it half-heartedly. Wow, Dad. I think that was an actual declaration of affection. I might die of shock. Stoic snorted at the teasing tone, a weight lifting from his extremely broad shoulders as they settled back into their normal relationship that didn't include yelling at each other and saying cruel things they didn't mean. Hiccup, without any fear of my being angry, please tell me you know how to use that sword you're holding. Hiccup glanced up at his father's serious tone, the underlying pleading almost easy to miss, but he knew the man well enough to catch it. Hiccup hefted the sword properly again and twirled it around his hand in a show of practiced control. Yeah. I know how to use it. Not the best, but sufficient enough to defend myself from one Ilof the Lucky. I'm assuming you already guessed that Astrid taught me, or you wouldn't have offered me up like a lamb to slaughter. Stoic nodded, further relieved. That's good. I'm sorry I didn't teach you myself. I should have. Can you forgive your father his yark-earedness? Sure, Dad. Hiccup paused as they approached the set of steps that led up to the monster-sized doors that enclosed the great hall carved out of a small mountain of rock, Astrid waiting for them just outside. The giant statues on either side of the door made her look like a child's doll. You know, I wouldn't mind if you wanted to teach me more. Like sailing and dragon hunting and more combat. I like training with Astrid, but I'm sure there's more that I could learn. And just between you and me, my ability to concentrate is about zilch when she's sparring with me, he whispered. Stoic guffawed for a minute, bringing tears of laughter to his eyes. Oh, son. I could never spar properly with your mother either, he said through his retreating chuckles, wiping his eyes. He smiled down at the boy conspiratorially. There's nothing like a beautiful female to turn us into hopeless dolts, eh, Hiccup? Hiccup found himself flushing again, peeking up at his own beautiful female. I've come to the conclusion that they are the real leaders of the tribe. Just look at who every single person in the tribe will bend over backwards for, a wrinkled, hunchbacked, little old lady that doesn't even speak real words. If that's not an unspoken leader of the tribe, then I don't know what is. Stoic clapped Hiccup's shoulder, nearly sending the auburn-haired boy to his knees. Your mother would be proud of you for figuring that little secret of life out so early. Most men never understand it until they've been married for years. Including you. Including me. Hiccup grinned up at his dad, his chest filling with pride at the approving look he was being given. All right. Let's get this over with. I have a future father-in-law to impress. That's my boy. Stoic followed his son up the steps. Astrid held out her sword as they approached, eyes drinking in the sight of the two haddocks getting along eagerly. Here, Hiccup. Use my sword. It's a better length and weight for you than. She took in the design on the hilt of the sword Hiccup was carrying, Spitaloot's sword. Hiccup was quick to thrust the bigger sword into his father's hand and take Astrid's. Thank you, my goddess. I actually have a chance now. My arm would have been screaming with the other in no time. She smiled at him softly, a hint of a blush rising in her cheeks at the endearment, and brightening further as she leaned over quickly and kissed his cheek in front of the smirking chief of Berk. Good luck, babe. Gods, I love her. Hiccup gave her a genuine smile that reflected that thought before the reality of what he was walking into settled on him again. Breathing deeply, he pushed open one of the doors to find a packed hall filled with close to a couple hundred Vikings of all ages, their voices rumbling over him in a wave. That wave of noise quieted in degrees as he was spotted. Squaring his shoulders, Hiccup walked through the silent and staring people, clutching Astrid's sword for courage, and pretending this was just another day in his usually monotonous life. It only took what felt like a year to reach the raised platform that housed the head table of the hall. Unlike most of the others that had been pushed off to the side until needed for a tribe feast, the head table never moved. This one was nearly as heavy as your average ship and made of incredibly thick blackwood imported from some place called Africa, where the people were rumored to have skin just as dark as the wood, and it was so far south that it never snowed except for a few mountain peaks. The concept of no snow to deal with 10 months of the year was mind-boggling. The table had stood in this spot since the first generation of hooligans had settled on the island, brought by the first Hamish, and it was likely to never move again. And standing on top of that table was a very pissed-off-looking Ilof, tied as he bragged he could be, and wielding a broadsword in his left hand that was easily twice the length and weight of Astrid's. Just frigging fantastic, Hiccup muttered under his breath. But he hadn't really been expecting anything less, despite his hopes to the contrary. He'd be lucky to survive one blow from that sword. Only thing to do is to avoid it as much as possible, Hiccup thought to himself grimly. Are you ready to die, cheap fart? Ilof taunted as Hiccup used a chair to jump up onto the table with something resembling grace. Hiccup summoned every ounce of false bravado he had within him and dug out a comeback from who knew where that he was incredibly pleased with. He raised his borrowed sword in a mocking salute. Are you ready to be shown up by a wisp of a sheep fart, Ilof? Who doesn't he understand the word no? Or is it only girls half your weight that can best you? A murmur of interest went through the crowd at the implication that there might be more to the story of yesterday's events than most knew. The bigger boy snarled and surged forward, already forgetting the limited range of his feet. He stumbled badly and cursed foully before righting himself and shuffling towards Hiccup. "You'll pay for that, Haddock." Hiccup neatly sidestepped the first swing of the broadsword, smirking, wishing he was even half as brave as he pretended to be. "You can try, Olafson." Up in the treetops, Toothless' ears twitched as he heard the humans below start to move en masse, surprising him enough to draw away from the very satisfying pastime of making his intended mate purr with pleasure as he licked her head and neck all over. "What's going on?" she asked as they both sat up and looked down at the village below where all of the humans were hiking up to their gathering place in a big cave. "No idea, but I'm curious enough to want to know. Perhaps we can see something through the small openings in the top that the smoke comes out of," Luna suggested. She'd never admit it, but the humans were suddenly a lot more interesting than she'd thought they could be. Especially the girl with wheat-colored hair that had defended her young mate so ferociously. That was an attitude that Luna could respect. Worth a try. After listening very carefully and scanning the entire area for any stray humans, the dragons flew down the hill and landed lightly on the natural rock roof. Their idea of looking through the holes was swiftly shot down as the smoke stung their eyes. Wrinkling her snout in disgust, Luna shook her head. "It's no good. This isn't worth it." Hiccup paced in annoyance for a minute before coming to a sudden stop. "Luna, has any dragon ever tried to connect to a human's mind? Hear their thoughts and see through their eyes like dragons can with each other?" Luna stared at her pitch-black companion with wide sky-blue eyes. "Just when I think I know him, he comes up with another outlandish idea. I have never heard of such a thing, no, but there are no humans where I come from." "Are you saying you want to try it? Connect to a human?" "Yes. I think I am." "Oh dear." Now it was Luna's turn to pace. "What if it doesn't work? What if they sense you? And who would you pick?" "The big one, their alpha." Toothless was nowhere near as worried as his girlfriend. He shrugged negligently. "I doubt their brains are advanced enough to sense telepathy. And I'll try and connect to the young male, of course. He and the girl are the only ones I'm really interested in keeping track of because they know about me." "Right," Luna said skeptically as she finished another circuit of her chosen path, paws silent like a cat's, and narrowed her eyes at the intrepid male dragon. But it was too late, for he already had his eyes closed and a faint wrinkle of concentration between his eyes. She sighed, sat on her haunches in front of him, and waited, her tail twitching with agitation and worry. Toothless sent his consciousness into the mass of humanity below his feet, searching for the vaguely familiar feel of a human boy that he felt drawn to in some strange way. "Maybe it's because we're both young males in love with dominant females." He gave a mental snort at that very true thought and continued to skim over the dozens of thought patterns that felt wrong, skipping the female ones automatically, until he finally landed in the mind of the boy known as Hiccup. And was immediately assaulted with the image of a sword swinging right at his head. Toothless scrambled out of the boy's mind and back into his own faster than a blink. "By the great dragon!" Toothless sputtered. "Humans are just as awful to each other as they are to us." "What? Why? What did you see?" "Sharp thing. About to cut off Hiccup's head. It was terrible." "Is he dead then?" "How would I know?" I left Toothless whined, pacing once again, and wondering why the thought of the young male human dying disturbed him so. Uncomfortable with the sight of Toothless in distress, Luna focused her hearing and actually concentrated on the muffled mess of noise coming from the space below her. Breathing. Lots of breathing. A fart. A sneeze. The sound of metal clashing against metal. A mass inhale as a crowd of humans held their breath all at the same time. And then a soft female voice barely vocalizing the words, "Come on, Hiccup. You can do this." "He's still alive," Luna reassured Toothless. "Which you would know if you would bother to settle down and concentrate with your senses as opposed to acting like an impulsive hatchling." Toothless snorted at the dragoness but calmed down enough to sit beside her, curling his tail around his paws. He listened to the sounds from below for a minute before he again grew impatient with the lack of knowledge. I'm going back into Hiccup's mind. I want to see. Luna rolled her eyes at him, but he never saw it. He was confronted by swinging metal once again, but this time Toothless stuck with it, breathing at the same time as Hiccup did as the boy raised his own sharp metal sword to block it and braced his feet to avoid being pushed backward by the greater strength of the other human. It didn't take long for Luna to give in to her curiosity as well. Caving in, she went searching for the Astrid girl's thoughts and joined her mind. Now she could hear every thought and worry the girl had about her young mate. And see the battle firsthand. The boy named Hiccup was half the size of his opponent, but not tied down and more agile by far. But even with his advantages, he was still having to work to keep his limbs attached to his body as the bigger boy did his best to hack Hiccup to pieces. Luna found Astrid's worry contagious and was soon wincing right along with the girl as the human boys fought, knowing that Toothless was experiencing the fight firsthand. Hiccup's heart sounded like thunder in his ears and his entire world was focused on the sword in Ilof's hand and the boundaries of the table he was trapped on. Not even Astrid and his father standing just behind the ornately carved chairs could distract him right now. He'd quickly come to the conclusion that despite his father's good intentions, the table was a bad idea. Ilof couldn't take big steps, but he didn't need to once he had Hiccup trapped at an end of their insane fighting arena. What did Dad think I was going to do? Flip above Ilof's head like a fucking acrobat? Hiccup thought in disgust and alarm as he felt the back of one heel slide past the edge. Since acrobatics he'd never even attempted in a stress-free environment wasn't an option, Hiccup had been forced to actually use his own sword defensively, and his arms were growing numb from the constant pounding of the bigger sword against his. Even tied up, the older boy was too bloody graceful and aware of his surroundings to actually step off the table by accident. He wasn't called the Lucky for nothing, Ilof actually was a very good warrior. And despite his haphazard and random training with Astrid, there was no way Hiccup was skilled enough with a sword to disarm Ilof. Astrid could have done it in her sleep, probably. If Hiccup wanted to come out of this the victor, then he had only one option left, make Ilof bleed. And that meant going on the offensive, but Hiccup couldn't actually picture himself swinging his sword hard enough to make Ilof back up. Or maybe, it didn't. I need to remember what I do have going for me, and that's my intellect. Perhaps it's time to fight smarter, not harder. Ilof wasn't exactly being creative with his swings, but they came fast and furious. The only reason Hiccup was still standing was because Ilof was using the same pattern of attack of overhand and side to side. At the next overhead blow, Hiccup saw his chance and let the momentum of Ilof's sword on his own take him down to his knees, which put Ilof off balance slightly because he wasn't expecting it. In that brief moment of time, Hiccup dove right through the small gap between Ilof's braced legs, thanking Thor that he is small enough to do so, and let his sword drag across Ilof's calf as he did so. The recently sharpened sword sliced easily through the yak leather boot, his trousers, and just into the muscle. Hiccup slid along the table on his stomach for a moment, and then twisted so he was on his back, quickly bringing his sword up, just in case he needed to take another swipe or protect himself. Ilof howled, hopping on one foot as he turned around and looked down at Hiccup with an incredulous look on his face. There was utter silence and many dropped jaws in the hole for 10 seconds and then, Hiccup wins. Stoic crowed loud enough for even neighboring islands to hear, his voice echoing around the stone walls and decorated pillars. He's drawn blood. The whole erupted in cheers for their chief's son, most of the tribe having found themselves coming to root for him throughout the course of the battle even if they hadn't started that way. They'd all seen a boy who clearly knew more about fighting than anyone thought, and who possessed a determination and willpower to succeed that far exceeded his physical limitations. No one would ever say that Hiccup had it easy, either. Despite his opponent's handicaps, Ilof had nearly knocked him off the table or severed a limb at least a dozen times. If the undersized boy hadn't been so quick at dodging and literally jumping out of the way, he would have lost. Hiccup had deserved their cheers and had won a lot of respect that day that he'd never previously been given. As Ilof scowled and hacked through the rope tying his feet together, Astrid leapt up onto the table and nearly knocked Hiccup back down as he was sitting up. "You were brilliant, Hiccup," she gushed as she threw her arms around his neck and beamed at him, eyes shining brightly in the torchlight that lit the glorified cave. Hiccup dropped her sword and hugged her back. "Thanks to you. I'd be dead if you hadn't trained me," he said, pushing her long bangs behind her ear so he could see her eyes better. Astrid immediately shook them back, smirking. Nah, you would have ended up on the floor in about 5 seconds flat, but not dead. Thanks, he said dryly. His lips twitched up into a matching smirk. Guess what, he whispered conspiratorially. What, she whispered back, beautiful blue eyes twinkling. I get to keep you now. Her eyes turned soft. I know. And then their mouths were exchanging tender demonstrations of love in a mutual fashion that left the men in the crowd grinning and the women sighing at the romantic picture. Ilof vaulted off the table in disgust, cursed as he landed on his bleeding leg, then glared at the couple while his father untied his right hand from his belt. Olaf couldn't help himself. I don't see anything frigid about that, he teased his surly son. He grinned as Ilof stomped 3 steps, swore, then limped away, favoring his left leg, pushing his way through the crowd rudely. Olaf couldn't think of a more fitting punishment for his son than to be beaten by Hiccup, but they were going to have to work on that attitude. When Stoic looked over at his friend, Hector was growling and making a face at the public display of affection his daughter was currently engaged in. He figured the only reason that Hiccup was still breathing right now was because Alga was literally holding her husband back, and the boy was keeping his hands very properly on the girl's upper back. And it was clearly Astrid who was clinging to Hiccup. And they were very wisely keeping their tongues inside their own mouths. But the sweet kisses just kept going as if they could happily sit on the table and make out all day. Lucky boy. Gods, I miss doing that with Valka. To dispel the gloomy thought, he sidled over to Hector's free side and nudged him with an elbow. Did you really think you could ever break those two up? Hector sighed, ripping his fierce gaze away from the teenagers and giving Stoic a look that more or less said drop dead. But he shook his head. I should have known that forbidding Astrid to do something would just make her want it more. Not sure how I missed the fact that she's been training Hiccup behind our backs, though. At least they're too young to get married yet. I don't even want to think about what all of that entails. Stoic and Alga laughed at Hector's woebegone expression. He clapped his friend on the back and, smirking, said, but just think of the beautiful grandbabies they'll make together. Hector shuddered visibly. Oh gods. Toothless and Luna were pulled from their voyeuristic spying on the teens when the sound of the front door crashing open jolted them back into awareness of the real world. They quickly flew off the back of the great hall and towards the nearest cover in the trees, then turned around and made sure they hadn't been spotted. All they saw was the one called Ilof limping down the path with a few other similarly aged boys following behind, doing their best to tell him how magnificent he'd been even while tied down, and the only reason he'd lost was because Hiccup was a sneaky little bastard who'd cheated the rules of normal combat. Toothless and Luna scoffed at that, having experienced the thoughts of 2 other teenagers who'd seen nothing wrong with Hiccup's clever move. As they padded quietly through the forest to stay out of sight, Toothless asked, so, what do you think of the humans now? I suppose spying on them is a better pastime than we first thought, Luna admitted. Especially if they are kissing, she added cheekily, inspiring Toothless to give her a knowing grin. She'd learned the proper name for tongue-licking while in Astrid's mind. Oh, and I found out what fiancé means. Yeah. It means what we are, promised to mate when we're old enough. And how soon is that? Toothless asked in what he hoped was a casual manner, holding his breath until he heard the answer. Luna looked at him through her lashes and smirked. She made him wait for a dozen, pounding heartbeats before she said, when spring comes again, most likely. If Toothless' steps were a little bouncier after that, would you blame him? /N, did any of you see that coming? I doubt it, because even I didn't know that Hiccup was going to fight Ilof until Stoic randomly suggested it while I was typing. Laughing smiley. Chapter 14, Arrows to the Heart. Chapter text. Arrows to the Heart. Hiccup spent the next 2 weeks in a flurry of activity. His days were packed with all of the training exercises that Stoic could squash into them, leaving Hiccup exhausted but happy. They also happened to be the most exciting thing happening in the village at the moment, so instead of preparing for winter like everyone should have been doing, Hiccup ended up with a vast and varied audience that came and went as people made excuses to stop by for a quick peek at the heir's progress. At least they were getting some extra exercise. And his nights were spent camping, to prove his original point of independence. With Astrid. Happy sigh. And every other teenager who thought camping away from the parental units was a fantastic idea. Groan. This was such a hit, that it became an end-of-summer tradition on Berk for years to come. Possibly for the parents even more so than the kids if the number of babies born 9 months later was any indication. The good news was that Hiccup had made another real friend in the form of Fish Legs. During the inevitable late-night babbling that occurs when you put so many teenagers in the same place with no supervision, Hiccup had discovered that Fish Legs was actually very intelligent and that they shared the same love of learning as much as they could about everything they could. And since Fish Legs had dedicated himself to finding out everything possible about dragons, something that Hiccup had only been able to do on the sly, he spent hours quizzing the bigger but younger boy, much to Snotlout's disgust. The bad news was that Hiccup never found more than a moment or two alone with Astrid per day, so their displays of affection were restrained to quick pecks on the cheek and some covert hand-holding. Anything more and the other kids teased them unmercifully. As in, Hiccup had heard about 100 different renditions of Hiccup and Astrid, sitting in a tree, KISSING, and thought he might go batty if he heard it even one more time. So when an opportunity for some alone time showed up, our feature couple were all over it like a yak on the first patch of grass in the spring. Today's lesson is archery, Stoic said to his eager pupils, pulling a 6-foot length of beautifully carved supple wood out from behind his back. He chuckled when every single young face fell in disgust. Weren't expecting that, were you? I know it's not the most intimidating of weapons, but there's always a time and place for a good bow. Hunting, for example. Not many animals will let you within axe reach, he joked. Now, Stoic didn't usually train the children, having too many other chiefy-type things to deal with, but because he'd dedicated himself to catching Hiccup up on his training, he'd somehow ended up teaching all of the other teenagers in Hiccup's age range as well, even though they had already had all of these lessons. The novelty of it, or something. Snotlout grunted in dismissal. I'm already good enough at the bow and arrow. I don't need to practice more. Stoic raised a bushy red brow as Astrid blatantly rolled her eyes at Hiccup, smirking knowingly. He took that to mean that Snotlout was barely proficient, at best. Thank you, Astrid. Let's have some fun with the next generation of louts, shall we? All right, then, Snotlout. He held out his unstrung bow and a quiver of arrows that Gobber magically appeared with. Take this, string the bow, and shoot an arrow into the ballsy of yonder target, he said in his no-nonsense chief voice, pointing at the furthest target available, clear across the very large clearing, and you can go. If you fail, you will be staying for the lesson. Or, you can muck out the sheep pens without having to prove yourself. Snotlout's eyes widened in horror at his options. No matter what he did, he would look like a fool. But pride had him snatching the massive bow out of the chief's hand. Maybe I'll get lucky. Fine. I'll shoot the target, he sneered as he unwound the string from around the wood that towered over his head. It took every ounce of muscle power he had to bend the bow to make the string reach, bracing his foot in the center and grunting with the effort. The not-so-subtle sniggers from the other kids just fueled him on, determination finding new feats of strength that he didn't know he possessed. Ha! He crowed internally when the wood was finally bow-shaped and the string attached. Even bent, it was still just as tall as him. Gods, I will never be able to draw this properly. But they don't need to know that. Yet. Snotlout turned and smirked at his audience of peers. I'd like to see any of you do that faster. You're on, Astrid said, unable to resist a challenge. After you shoot it. Snotlout curled his lip up at the girl. Gods, I hate her almost as much as I like her. She's probably going to make it look easy. Why do I do this to myself all the time? Gobber nudged Stoic with an elbow and whispered, I didn't think the boy would even be able to string your bow. I'm reluctantly impressed. So am I, Stoic mumbled back, watching with fascinated eyes as the short and stout boy doggedly notched an arrow into the massive bow and lined up with the target on the other side of the clearing. Bet it doesn't even make it halfway, he said under his breath to his longtime friend. I say 3/4, Gobber stage whispered back, observing the boy's teeth-gritting efforts at pulling the string back towards his ear. Loser buys the beer tonight. You're on. 5 seconds later, they picked their jaws up off the ground. Who wins if he actually managed to shoot within a handspan of the target? Gobber asked. No one. Snotlout. Nah. Stoic shrugged and stepped forward to take his bow back. He clapped the boy on the back. That's actually better than I expected, young Snotlout. But you still have to stay for the lesson. The dark brown-haired boy practically beamed at the back-assed praise and then all but strutted back into his place with the other teens. Yep. I dare any of you to top that. Oh, I'll do better, Astrid said, sneering at the annoying boy who was always so full of himself. And I'll even hit the target. Stoic laughed, shaking his head at the feisty girl. That won't be necessary, Astrid. I didn't bring my bow up here to watch the lot of you try to shoot it, but to use as a demonstration weapon so I don't break the wee twigs that you half-grown children need to shoot with. Astrid crossed her arms over her chest and glared at the chief, disgusted that she'd been denied her chance to show up Snotlout. And at being called a child. Hiccup, sensing her ire, whispered to her, I'm sure we can borrow Dad's bow when he's away sometime and you can practice with it. She softened, shooting her fiancé a grateful look. Meanwhile, Gobber had been walking down the line of teens, handing each of the trainees a 4-foot bow, already strung, while Stoic had continued talking. As I was saying before, the bow is a very useful weapon to have. It can even be used against dragons, if you're a particularly good archer and can target the weak places like the eyes. But don't miss, you'll just piss them off. Stoic laughed at his own wit. The exceedingly large man was still grinning when he turned his focus on his son. Hiccup. Have you and Astrid practiced with a bow at all during your secretive training sessions? Even though there was no condemnation in his father's voice, Hiccup still couldn't meet his eyes, instead staring at the weapon in his hands as he restlessly ran his hands over it. There would always be that lingering sensation of guilt. No, actually. The bows are kept in the storehouse and it would have looked funny if Astrid was seen carrying one of them around for no good reason. It's not exactly her weapon of choice, as we all know. This last was said with an amused look towards said girl who currently had her favorite axe strapped to her back. Astrid grinned back, nudging Hiccup with her shoulder. Stoic snorted in amusement. True, true. Never seen the girl with a bow, that I can remember. But can you use one, Astrid? She raised a brow at the stupid question. Does he not know me at all? Of course I can shoot a bow. Mother made sure that I'm better than proficient with every possible weapon known to Viking kind. Stoic let out a great belly laugh, shaking his head. Of course she has. Alga won Best Female Warrior at the clan gatherings 3 years in a row back when she was a teenager. They don't let her compete anymore. I'm not allowed to compete, either. He couldn't help but boast a little. I can't wait till I'm 16 and I can compete, Astrid said with a determined glint in her eyes. I fully intend to equal Mother's performance. I have no doubt you will, Lady Hiccup said, firmly in the supportive fiancé category. His eyes caught hers and he was very pleased to see a hint of color grace her cheekbones and her pupils expand. Oh. She likes that one. Lady it is. Gag me with a spoon, Snotlout muttered. Astrid's eyes shot to the other boy and she glared imaginary daggers. That can easily be arranged, Jorgensen, so shut it with the commentary or you will regret it. Snotlout gulped and backed up a step. By the gods, she can be frightening sometimes. What is wrong with me that I'm turned on by it? Yes, Astrid. Sorry, Astrid. Stoic snorted under his breath. That girl is something else. She'll be a good mate for Hiccup when it's his turn to rule. No one would dare oppose him with her by his side. Right. All taunting aside, let's see what you've got, Astrid. Gladly the girl said. She traded her axe for a quiver of arrows and slung it across her back, handing the axe to Gobber for safekeeping. Then, after taking up a solid stance, she notched an arrow and drew back the string to her ear and sighted along the shaft to the nearest target about 10 feet away. A deep breath in and out for absolute stillness, and then she let fly. The arrow landed dead center in the target and sank almost halfway through, prompting a quiet whoop from Hiccup. Good, Stoic praised. How about, he never got to finish his sentence as he watched in pleased admiration as the girl whipped out another arrow and sent it flying to the next furthest target about 20 feet away. The arrow also landed dead center. She continued to loose arrows until all 5 targets set on a diagonal line, including the furthest one that Snotlout had almost hit, had a vibrating arrow sitting in the center of each. Their curious audience of passers-by cheered louder with each successful bullseye. Stoic was very impressed. Girl actually does have a shot of equaling her mother in the annual Barbaric Archipelago Games. Very good, Astrid. Since you've already taught my son the basics of every other weapon, why don't you also show Hiccup how to use a bow while the others give me a demonstration of their skills? Astrid beamed, pleased that she'd impressed the chief. Sure. As she turned to Hiccup, who was grinning at her rather dopily with pride, she heard Stoic say, how about you first, fish legs? Oh, okay, the poor boy stuttered out. Astrid mentally winced. Fish legs was easily the least skilled with a bow of all of them, or any weapon, for that matter, but not for lack of trying. He just couldn't seem to figure out how to make his big body work for him instead of against him. If he ever did, watch out, world. She put her bow down on the ground and focused on Hiccup, who was already holding his bow more or less correctly and drawing back the string experimentally, getting a feel for it. That's good, Hiccup. But you'll have to pull it back further than that to make an arrow get anywhere. Oh. Sure. Hiccup put a bit more effort into it and then released the string. It snapped forward and he could feel the released power of the bow. Sweet. I think I like this weapon. Astrid turned Hiccup around so he was facing away from the group of teens and towards a cluster of boulders that didn't have any bystanders lingering by them, and then handed him an arrow from her quiver. All right. Now point your bow at the ground and knock the arrow into the string and hold it steady with your fingers. Make sure the top of the triangle of fletching feathers is pointed outwards. She leaned into him as she helped him do what she described. Now rest the shaft on top of the knuckle of your left hand. Good. Hiccup could barely concentrate as her, very, hands-on instructions continued and was grateful they were facing away from everyone for their own safety. In case he accidentally shot a wild arrow. Astrid was practically breathing in his ear as she spoke softly and her chest was pressed into his back as she basically wrapped her arms along his. His body also thought that Astrid's proximity was worthy of notice and was overheating in less time than it took to actually pick a gap between boulders to aim at. Thor, this must be the sweetest torture ever. Please don't let it ever stop. And thank you to whomever for inventing long tunics and fluffy vests that cover things best left not seen by the public. Now pull back. Further. Further. Look down the shaft. Thor, help me, she said shaft again. I might go insane if I hear her say that even one more time while she whispers in my ear. Somehow, Hiccup kept his eyes open and managed not to groan out loud, but it was a close thing. Very close. Stay focused on your target. Deep breath in. Slow breath out. Freeze. And release. Hiccup did. Nearly in more ways than one. But the snap of the string skimming alone his forearm was enough of a distraction to pull his focus forwards again. Frozen in place with Astrid pressed to his back, he tracked the path of his arrow. It landed where he'd pointed it. As if he'd been released like a coiled spring, Hiccup jumped a foot in the air, fist raised in triumph. Yes. Astrid laughed. Easy there, Fliboy. That was a massive target. Let's see how you do with a real target and without my help. Hiccup was all for it. He turned around and faced the closest target, which now had 4 more arrows poking out of it. None buried as far as Astrid's, and none as close to the center as hers, but at least the other teens had hit it. Now fueled by excited adrenaline, Hiccup repeated all of the steps Astrid had walked him through, focused with narrow-eyed determination at the dead center of the target, and let fly with another arrow. It landed right beside Astrid's arrow. Hiccup did the jump of joy again. Astrid was suitably impressed, although not terribly surprised, since he'd already proved himself to be adept at aiming throwing knives. His hand-to-eye coordination was better than most and he was an excellent judge of scale and distances. Very good, Hiccup, she praised. Try the next one. Stoic's focus was drawn away from the teenagers now making attempts at hitting the furthest target by the cheers of the watching crowd. Who most certainly weren't cheering for the twins, Fishlegs, or Snotlout. He turned just in time to see Hiccup aim an arrow at the second closest target. A rapid look at the first target showed 2 arrows in the center. A fluke. Stoic refocused on the second target. The boy hit the bullseye, right beside Astrid's arrow. Again. Stoic raised a brow in surprise. Didn't know he would be that good at something. Ever. and then he felt bad for thinking it. I should have more faith in my son. He is my son after all. Well done, Hiccup. Stoic called loud enough to be heard over the crowd of cheering onlookers. For the most part, the village as a whole had decided to root for Hiccup as he trained, eager to make up for their years of derision, even if it had only been in their minds. Hiccup grinned at his dad. Thanks. This weapon doesn't care how tall you are or how strong you are. It's all about angles and precision and focus. Stoic mentally rolled his eyes. Such a Hiccup thing to say. But he's right. How about you try your focus on the next target, son? Hiccup did so eagerly, holding out a